Chapter 1530. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1530. A realization: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. As the blue force flooded Lionel's veins, the development of his spear domain in his mind evolved. The neural connections between them and his body grew thicker and more numerous, muscle memory that Lionel had already formed becoming far more refined, perfect, and even more reflexive than before. At the same time, Lionel's king's might surged into his body. A royal air bloomed from Lionel unconsciously, his bearing and presence alone exuding a pressure that blanketed the estate. It felt as though violet clouds were gathering above, a beautiful scenery that many only wanted to bow to appeared. The silhouette of a humanoid donned in armor and holding a bow and spear appeared to Lionel's back, only to fuse with his body. The intangible feeling suddenly became tangible, almost as though now every one of Lionel's actions held within it an artistic intention. While this was happening, the speed and healing branch of Lionel's starry-tailed fox lineage factor thrummed with life and vitality. Even without moving a single inch, Lionel knew that his speed had increased by more than tenfold, his already ridiculous healing factor also increasing once more. Now, whereas the limit was healing from 7th-dimensional injuries, Lionel felt he could instantly heal from 8th-dimensional injuries. On top of this, he also felt that he could use instant recovery, not just once, but 3 times a day. Still, the largest changes were to the most directly body-related lineage factor of them all, Lionel's metal synergy bloodline. His bronze runes reacted as though they had been stuffed with stimulants. Lionel's cells became more compact and began to give off a bluish bronze hue of their own. His body had already been strong enough to match Tier 9 bronze treasures or even quasi-silver treasures, but the strength it was giving off now transcended that. Lionel felt that he had definitely crossed the 6th-dimensional barrier despite his body still being within the 5th. The changes came in waves and they seemed unending. And yet, rather than becoming more complex, it felt like they were all slowly coming together, revolving around the very same path from the very beginning, as though there was only ever one real path to follow in the first place. Every breakthrough in tier was like another step in evolution. Rather than just the shackles of his mind being undone as was customary for the 5th dimension, it felt like his entire being was being unshackled. By the end of it, Lionel had such a clear vision of what he wanted that he didn't even hesitate to forget everything he knew and form 10 stars instead of 9. Lionel realized that the only reason his 7th and 8th stars were made of scarlet star force was because he had made it so by using his innate nodes to break through as he had done. However, that didn't mean that he was locked down toward a single path. In fact, if he formed his 9th and 10th stars with scarlet star force as well, it would almost be overkill. The way Lionel saw it, the setup of his stars were perfect currently. N0. E. LBI. N.Et. He had 3 of Dream Force. This would work to reinforce and power his ability index and his strongest weapon, his mind. He had 3 for Vital Star Force. He had known from the very beginning how important his body would be to him. This was why he had formed his innate nodes as he had, 1 in the brain stem, 2 down the spine, 2 in his heart, 2 in his lungs, 2 in his kidneys and 1 in his stomach. This configuration was perfect for fueling the strength of his body and revitalizing it. With 3 such stars, this would be supplemented well. But why would he need 4 Scarlet Star Force stars? He already had 2 nodes and 2 stars, for centers from which he could pull from. He definitely didn't need 6 and it wouldn't make him any more powerful. In fact, it might lead to a situation where he was being harmed by his own strength instead. So, instead, Lionel helped fuel the final thing he needed, the very thing he would need to balance his Scarlet Star Force. Lionel had been worrying about exactly how to form a source of this energy for a long while and he didn't expect for it to fall in his lap like this. And now, he happened to have just enough dark and water force affinity to trigger its appearance. In the dimensional verse, Lionel wouldn't dare to do this. The quantity of force was too small and too low quality. It was difficult for him to find Vital Star Force and Scarlet Star Force to use. However, what these last 7 days had taught him was that this world was very different. It somehow had an abundance of this force, so much that Lionel was in awe. So he was certain. He was certain that if he tried to form his final 2 stars of void star force, he might be able to succeed. Lionel didn't rely on himself alone. Within the countless books of the oligarch family, they had a description of true star forces, and among them, void star force was depicted. Within this depiction, a complex star rune was drawn. This star rune was precisely the most basic rune of void star force, the equivalent of the very first destruction rune Lionel had ever formed. Thanks to this book, Lionel realized something shocking. In his deconstruction of Dimensional Cleanse, Lionel noticed that the individual pieces of the visualization were actually all true state forces. Somehow, the creator of Dimensional Cleanse had created a natural force art capable of fusing together all of the basic true state star runes in existence. That was when Lionel understood. He understood why Dimensional Cleanse could be used with any other technique. It was because it was compatible with every technique to begin with. If Lionel wanted to pull a certain energy toward him, all he needed to do was focus on the rune and have the right affinity. With those 2 things put together, he would form his 9th and 10th stars. Chapter 1531. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1531. A mistake? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was in a state of unprecedented focus. There was no doubt that the void star force came toward him at a much slower pace that the others had. His affinity with water force wasn't high enough to control a true state water force as easily as he could dream force or scarlet star force. In addition, when he had first formed his connection with vital star force, he had been within a trial where it was quite literally the only force around, making it far easier. Still, while the task was slow, it wasn't impossible. It was only about 1% as fast as the formation of his other stars, but this 1% shouldn't be underestimated. In fact, this 1% was enough for the foundation of the estate to still continue to tremble. Lionel was able to make up with his own weaknesses with his comprehension of the visualization that formed the core of the 5th dimensional layer of Dimensional Cleanse. By this point, he had comprehended it to the point that he could also pass it down to others without restriction. With this comprehension, the force art had practically become his own, dancing and shifting to the whims of his palms as he pleased and bringing forth the force he asked for obediently. If it wasn't for the fact that Lionel was trying to form 2 stars at once, this level of comprehension would have been enough to net him at least 10% of his maximum speed. But at this point, this no longer mattered. He had already chosen his path. Void star force radiated out in the surrounding, a dense and sticky darkness fighting for a balance with Lionel's scarlet star force. Lionel pressed the feeling down. It wasn't time for them to fight yet. Right now, he needed balance. 2 kernels formed in his ethereal glabella, his massive mage core twinkling as the leaves of water force reacted, beginning to slowly evolve beneath the stronger currents of force. The moment the kernels formed, Lionel knew he had already succeeded. These were likely the infant stages of a star, so as long as he fueled them more, they would grow to the same size as the others. And, if he wasn't them to match his scarlet star force stars, he would need to comprehend their void runes. But for now, Lionel only focused on enlarging them, and that he did. With every revolution, his affinity grew and the speed increased. In 2 days, he had already caught up by half. In 5, it was already at 90%. By the end of the 2nd week, WNG. A ripple shot out from Lionel, a balance becoming forcefully struck between his stars. One side of his body rolled with a dark blue, the other dancing with a red gold. Like fire and water, they twisted around and rejected one another, fighting for supremacy. At that moment, it was surprisingly Lionel's mage core that took center stage, shining a bright light that forced the 2 to calm, settling down into a calm rhythm. Lionel's eyes snapped open, the almost 6,000 destruction runes in his irises slowly fading, but not before they bore a hole in the wall opposite him, only to be stopped by a hidden protection. Lionel's eyes didn't seem to reflect happiness in the slightest. In fact, his thoughts had already turned toward the 6th dimensional layer of Dimensional Cleanse. Half of his month-long deadline had already passed. He didn't have time to waste. He could sense people rushing toward his room, having finally gotten a chance to burst through the barrier of force, but he completely ignored them. In fact, Lionel's eyes flashed, a strong earth force surging toward him. In just a few seconds, the room around him had become nothing more than a box of metal, fusing the doorway and windows. Lionel had gone from someone who could hardly move the force in this world to suddenly being able to force such an exaggerated him. "You all wait outside obediently while I break through." Lionel closed his eyes once more. The difficult work had already been done. With the foundation laid, breaking into the sixth dimension was as easy as flipping over a palm. However, when Lionel finally took a look at the sixth-dimensional layer, his brows jumped. He stayed silent for a long time before his lips suddenly curled into a smile. It seemed that he was correct. This dimensional cleanse technique, maybe its author really was right to brag so much in their introduction. Click. Lionel walked out of his room, his expression calm and indifferent. However, the scenery he walked into was anything but. The guest house he had been staying in was razed to the ground. In fact, the door he had just shut close behind him slowly fell backward, collapsing with a loud thud. Before Lionel, several individuals stood, among which was Mistress Olidark, whose eyes were narrowed. Right now, Lionel stood like a towering pillar. He wasn't actually so tall and he hadn't even grown a single inch, but something about his presence made him feel like a mountain that had just formed. His pale violet hair and eyes glowed with their own light as though coated with a fluorescent paint. His aura was intoxicating and it seemed to make his features an entire level more attractive, and on top of that, his power, 6 star. Mistress Olidark thought. All of this commotion was caused by his breakthrough. She wasn't here to personally witness it. In fact, she had only just come back. But this scene was enough for her to understand. According to reports, no one had been able to step foot within 50 meters of this place for the last 2 weeks. For some reason, Mistress Olidark felt a slight warning in her heart. Had she made a mistake? Her fingers twitched, thinking of killing Lionel right here and now. But when she remembered the meeting she had just been to, she slowly pushed down her killing intent. She still needed him. "Bow when you see the mistress." A booming voice cut through the silence, a wild pressure coming toward Lionel's head. Chapter 1532. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1532. To the field. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The voice had quite some power to it. It was as powerful as it was shocking. It was clear that his individual was just as interested in shocking Lionel as he was in displaying his might, looking to do something to break Lionel's momentum. There were several individuals startled by the change, many of whom were much further in the 6th star than Lionel himself. However, what no one could have expected was for Lionel to not react in the slightest. It was as though he hadn't heard the slightest thing. He might have even given a fly buzzing around him more attention than he gave this booming voice. Lionel's mind had already been sharp before his breakthroughs, but now he was on a completely different level. Still, even if he hadn't had these breakthroughs, the momentum someone needed to gather up to shout so loudly was too obvious. Lionel had already caught what would happen the moment this individual took a much deeper than usual breath. By the time they actually shouted, they might as well have been nothing more than a jumping clown. In the past, Lionel didn't really care much about kneeling. He had grown up in an empire that practically deified his grandfather, and to him he never really attached any great importance to it. It was what everyone did, and it didn't have the same weight of stigma attached to it that some parts of history would lead one to believe. However, after his time in the Camelot zone, he had grown a distaste for it. If the person you were kneeling to didn't have any foul intentions, doing so might still be fine. However, if the person you were kneeling for wanted to use it for no other purpose than stepping over your head, it was something that could easily infuriate Lionel. Let alone the fact he wouldn't listen to a jumping clown like that one. Even if no one had said anything, he would never kneel to a person like Mistress Olidark, who clearly had no regard for him. This little outburst, though, did give Lionel a hint of information, though. He hadn't spent very long in the Olidark estate, but he had run into several young men who seemed intent on observing him, especially during his hour in the library. These were all young men, all around the same age, and all of which held a certain standard of talent. It wasn't too difficult to guess what they were doing here. It was like Mistress Olidark had built up her own little army of live-in son-in-laws for her granddaughter to pick and choose from. Such a thing was one part amusing and another part infuriating. The one who had spoken just now was the only one that Lionel had come across that had a presence similar to or more powerful than the young man that had been by Athre's side that day. He had already heard talks around of a Sebastian and Slayton many times already. So he assumed that this person was one of the two of them. Still, Lionel found it funny. These two were supposedly the strongest, and yet they were also the most happy to wag their tails and please. It made Lionel wonder if it was really their talent that made them the strongest, or if it was their boot-licking that just gained them far more resources than everyone else. Of course, while he was insulting them, Lionel thought of another more sinister possibility, and that was that Mistress Olidark had managed to tighten a much shorter leash on these two precisely because of their talent. If that was the case, he needed to be wary of such methods. "Do you all need something?" Lionel asked lightly. His voice was like a light breeze that whisked away the echoes of Sebastian's voice. It was as though the shout itself never happened, but it was precisely this that made things so embarrassing for the latter. "You," Sebastian's mouth snapped close the moment Mistress Olidark raised a hand. By this point, Lionel's lack of respect was grating on her nerves. She might be able to find the amusement in it when it was just the two of them, but when everyone was scrutinizing her like this, it made it 10 times more infuriating than it should have been. "You destroyed all of this?" Mistress Olidark asked. "You never provided me with a proper training room. What else could I destroy if not this?" Rather than becoming more infuriated, Mistress Olidark only became calmer. "The expenses for this guest house and the surrounding damage will come directly from your merits. Until you gather enough to pay it back, the house will not give you any resources." Mistress Olidark expected Lionel to fly into a rage when he heard this, giving her an opportunity to suppress him further. But all she received in return was a curled lip. Merits? Resources? After he had been through their library once, he already had all the information he needed. In fact, it wasn't just information about this that he had gathered. After the breakthrough in his mind, Lionel believed that he had thought of a viable method to shatter the barriers of this zone and catalyze their return home. Of course, this would require resources that he apparently wouldn't be receiving anymore until he met some arbitrary goal he had no doubt Mistress Olidark would inflate, but it wouldn't have been a good idea to gather said resources from this place to begin with. It would have been too suspicious. P1E's Visi, T, N0VE1B, in. The simple fact was that he didn't need anything this house could give him any more that he wouldn't be able to get himself when they inevitably forced him to go demon hunting again. In 2 more weeks, just like he said, he would leave this place. Lionel's derisive smile and silence dug into Mistress Olidark's nerves. However, she could only stare at him deeply before she spoke her next words. "Everyone to the training field. Now." Chapter 1533. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1533. Statues. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. It wasn't long until everyone had followed Mistress Olidark, and when they heard what was said, their expressions formed various shades of excitement and anticipation. According to Mistress Olidark, she had just gone to a gathering held by the 4 great families. At this meeting, all classified families and organizations were tasked with mandatory attendance to a second gathering, this one designed for what they called a future investment. Lionel had all the books of the Olidark family in his mind, so he knew about the 4 great families. The issue was that he didn't know anything else substantive about them. He read tales of their feats and grandeur, and they were also apparently the final line of defense between the human world and the chaos demons, but that was all Lionel knew. He didn't know the names of these 4 great families, he didn't even know where they were located. The same was the case for Mistress Olidark as well. In truth, this gathering wasn't designed for everyone across the human world. It only encompassed this region, a region they called a bubble. As for why they called it a bubble, it was because a bubble wasn't decided by scope, size, or even arbitrary distinctions or war like most territories were. Rather, a bubble was a point where the spatial spheres of this world and the demon world met. At every one of these points, a set of organizations and families were tasked with defending it in these positions that hung over abysses just like this city. Depending on the contact point to the demon world, you could run into stronger or weaker demons. Likewise, just like demons, these regions were classified as low class, middle class, high class, human class, fiend class and chaos class, labeling a bubble by its threat level. Though it was possible for a threat to appear that surpassed these threats, it wasn't too common. If such a thing ever happened, help could be called. But it was much more likely for higher-level bubbles to request aid from lower-level ones. This was what happened with Mistress Olidark's husband and son-in-law, which left her to command the house on her own. The bubble that the Olidarks defended in part was a lower-end middle-class bubble. A middle-class demon would appear here once every few years and it would require Mistress Olidark to deal with. If her husband was here, it would be his task normally. Such battles were tough and arduous, not to mention life-threatening. With what the Olidark family had to go through, it was no wonder they were so obsessed with becoming more powerful through any means necessary. Still, it was a bit odd to Lionel that the Olidark family had so much trouble with heirs. Their son-in-law was gone, but Lionel had never heard anything about Athri's mother. Then there was the useless Athri herself. And in this generation they had to recruit dozens of boys who clearly weren't of Olidark blood to save them? Something was definitely fishy, something that obviously wasn't described or detailed in their library. Lionel wasn't surprised though. Why would leave such a secret in such an easily accessible place? Lionel could only shake his head. There was no use speculating. The four great families wanted to gather together the budding talents of each class and give them an opportunity. What this opportunity was, no one quite knew. But what they did know was that the Olidark family was given 3 quotas. Mistress Olidark wasted no time giving the first 2 to Sebastian and Slayton. That left just a single spot left for those that remained, a spot that she expected them all to fight for. It was no wonder why they were all so excited. Beneath those 2, the divisions of power beneath the Olidark's family's potential son-in-laws were quite close. This meant that they all had an equal chance at claiming the final spot for themselves. Interesting. Lionel thought to himself. Originally, he wanted to just bide his time for the next week then find time to escape once he had solidified his standing. But this seemed like an interesting opportunity and it might help him gather what he needed to help everyone escape this zone faster. With that thought, Lionel had already decided that he would show however much strength he needed to claim this final spot for himself. Clearly, Mistress Olidark already expected him to do so. If it wasn't for his rudeness, she might have directly given it to him to begin with. This battle will be a battle royale. Fights against demons will never be organized and when in their world you must always remain alert. Show me you awareness and resourcefulness. Clear the grounds. She bellowed. The elders, Mistress Olidark, and the mischievous Athri all moved back, giving the 20 or so young men who remained enough space to battle. Just as she was about to signal the start, Sebastian suddenly spoke again. You had such a powerful breakthrough into the 6th star and you're equally as arrogant. I hope that you don't disappoint me. Sebastian's words seemed like he was levying a challenge toward Lionel, but what he was really doing was reminding everyone of the forcefulness of Lionel's breakthrough. At that moment, a realization came over the other young men. They had felt that their odds were relatively equal before, but remembering what had happened the last couple weeks, they felt that they had almost missed something huge. Their greatest threat might very well be this young man they knew so little about. On top of that, Mistress Olidark had actually tolerated his disrespect and didn't say anything. With the mistress temper, they would have been skinned alive for less. Suddenly, several intents locked onto Lionel. Mistress Olidark didn't say a word, but her gaze flickered with amusement. She still expected Lionel to win, but making him work harder wasn't a bad result either. He just might restrain himself a bit. Begin. Her voice descended as she signaled the start of the battle. However, what they didn't notice until this moment was that Lionel's hands were still lazily in his pockets, a light smile on his face. Even as a wave of young men suddenly surged toward him, he only light raised his foot and pressed it down. At that moment, a wave of blue energy rippled out like a tsunami. When it cleared, the only one who remained standing was Lionel. Well, there were others standing as well, about 20 ice statues worth. Chapter 1534. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 42 seconds p.m. Chapter 1534. Bronze. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel sat in silence, his legs crossed and his mind focused as though he relished in an awkward atmosphere. Currently, the group was on the back of an enormous flying bird, likely the largest creature that Lionel had ever seen, with a wingspan of at least 50 meters. There were 3 boxes strapped to the back of this bird in a line down its spine, and one of these boxes was shared by Lionel, Slayton, and Sebastian. Of his interactions with these people, all of them had been hostile. First he had a clash with Slayton about the unicorn demon corpse. And then there was the clash with Sebastian twice regarding things that were quite frankly small matters in Lionel's eyes. Slayton was an odd one. He continued to smile and hum as though nothing at all had happened. He had even pleasantly chatted with Lionel earlier as though he couldn't remember a thing. Though, to his surprise, Lionel seemed able to smile and talk as though nothing at all had happened as well, something that was quite rare among youths his age that he had met. The one who was truly making the atmosphere awkward was Sebastian, whose temper was nowhere near as amiable. He seemed to want to swallow Lionel alive, but unfortunately there wasn't much he could do at all. If he killed Lionel, he wouldn't just be fulfilling his wish, but he would be offending Mistress Olidark. If the Olidark family showed up without 3 seeds, what would the people say? The prestige of a family was far too important. It saved them from a lot of the infighting that might happen. Even if those that challenged you were ants and easily dealt with, if you constantly had to deal with such things again and again and again, then it would eventually wear down your resources as a family. As such, prestige and looking impregnable, at least from the outside, was very important. It saved the family experts, resources, and time. This way, you could put everything toward the real threats. Sebastian was an obedient dog of the Olidarks. How could he not place their well-being first? Right this moment, though, Lionel didn't care much about Sebastian's state of might. He was more so thinking about the size of this bird. Just how could such a large creature exist? There were too many secrets about this world that he still didn't understand. He had been in a mythological zone before, and though it took some liberties with the creation of its own version of the demon race, it was nothing like this. Of course, the Camelot zone had been much lower class and level, but Lionel wasn't sure if this was enough to explain things. He had met 6-dimensional creatures before, he had even fought them. They were still the size of normal animals, give or take a few meters. But dozens of meters like this? That was too exaggerated. Lionel, if you don't mind me asking, what's your 4th star? Slayton's eyes shone as he looked toward Lionel. Mine is related to water force as well, so we're somewhat destined in that regard. My 4th star is the sacred water star. 4th star was the term people in this world used to refer to their affinities. Usually, if they had a strong affinity for an element, it would be born within their stars at birth, thus the reason for the name. The sacred water star, or rather sacred water force, was a water and light force fusion. It wasn't a true state force, but it couldn't be considered bad as well. It was ranked about similarly to the Luxnix family's snow force on the light force rankings, and on the water force rankings, it was ranked around the 60s to 70s. It was quite good, but nowhere near the best. Lionel smiled. If he were to tell the truth, he would say Void Star Force, but he obviously couldn't do that. Of course, this wouldn't exactly be the truth either, since he had forced this force star into existence. Instead, Lionel replied, Dark Ice. Slayton's brows jumped. This wasn't because Lionel's force star was powerful, but rather because it was the direct opposite. Dark Ice Force combined water force and dark force, which was nice. But it was nowhere near top 100 in dark forces, and it didn't crack the top 100 in water force either. This made sense, of course. The dark ice ore that Lionel used to form the foundation for this was a fifth-dimensional ore. It was only made somewhat more powerful by Lionel fusing it with evolution ores. Since it could naturally exist in a fifth-dimensional state, its power was definitely lacking. This was why Slayton was so shocked. How could such a low-level force possibly create such a strong effect? Slayton couldn't help but inwardly narrow his eyes. Was Lionel lying to him? Or was he telling the truth and had other secrets? Sebastian snorted at that moment, clearly taking the opportunity to look down on Lionel. Even if he had thought of what Slayton had, so what? It made him feel better to do things like this. What these two didn't know was that any force in a large enough quantity and concentration could have miraculous effects. Under the boost given to his water force affinity by his two newly formed stars, the amount of dark ice force Lionel could use was astronomical. Weak or not, when it was concentrated to a point, even a powerful enemy would suffer. At that moment, the three felt the bird descending with great speed. Just minutes later, it touched the ground, jolting the box carriage they sat in. By a tacit agreement, the three stood all at once, stepping out to be hit with a wall of noise. All sorts of creatures and people could be found around, each seemingly from another middle-class power and many with strengths that made even Sebastian's brow furrow. Up ahead, there was a city with enormous bronze walls that towered hundreds of meters into the sky. It almost felt as though a giant had dropped a brass ring into an ant colony, and now they were all forced to look up at it in awe. There was no doubt that this was their destination, the location even a bird with a 50-meter wingspan hadn't dared fly into. Chapter 1535. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 1535. Fardan, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's eyes sparkled. The last time he had felt this level of awe was when he faced the gates of the Void Palace. Though, he could only remember feeling it 4 times in his lifetime. The first time was when he faced the walls of Valiant City. The second time was when he saw the capital of Earth. The third time was when he laid eyes on the vital star of the dimensional cleanse, trial. And the final was, of course, when he saw the Void Palace. Lionel had seen a lot by now and it took greater and greater feats to shock him, but this definitely met the necessary criteria. Maltalia? Ho ho, I didn't expect that your oligarch family would actually show its face. A chuckling hoarse feminine voice caught Lionel's attention, but he didn't bother to look over. It was clear that this person had ill will for the oligarch family, or maybe there was a rivalry of sorts, but Lionel didn't care about the face or prestige of the oligarch family, and he certainly wouldn't be stepping in to help them protect it. Regardless of Lionel's reaction, though, an older woman sauntered over, wearing a dress that was maybe much too modern for her age. It clung to her chest, hips and waist, leading down to a slit that revealed her right leg and the tall heels she was wearing. Though, despite the fact her style of dress didn't quite match her age, one had to admit that she was still quite the beauty all things considered. Despite the clearly venomous words she was speaking, her smile was still elegant and refined as 3 youths followed to her back. While Lionel didn't pay much attention to the interaction, he did take a look at where they had come from. However, when he didn't find anything of interest outside of another oversized beast, he turned back. If it wasn't for the fact he needed to be registered with the oligarch family, he would have long since left. Mistress Oligarch, or rather, Maltalia, turned an indifferent gaze over. However, her granddaughter was just as disappointing as usual. Unable to hide her emotions, Athri couldn't help but snarl when she saw who was coming over, her every reaction being written on her sleeve. The truth was that the departure of her grandfather and father was related to these people. While fighting against the demons was a burden everyone shared, it was just the nature of humans to look out for their own interests first. They had their own families to protect, their own lands, their own resources. They wouldn't easily leave their territory unless they were forced to. Such a thing was usually decided on a rotation or by a lottery where the winner was actually the loser. In addition to this, there were, of course, some placements that were better than others. Years ago, It was under the machination of this Fardan family that the two pillars of the oligarch family were shipped away to a high-class bubble that was being overrun. Since then, they hadn't been heard from. The interference between clashing points in space and bubbles made it difficult to communicate over long distances, especially when it was a separation between a large divide like middle and high class. The only family that didn't seem to have any limits on their communication at all were the four great families. Kivire Fardan chuckled when she saw Athri's reaction, a girl to her back looking toward the useless heiress with a look of clear derision. Words probably couldn't explain how much she looked down upon this flower in a vase. "We don't welcome you here, you may leave." Mistress Olidark had, at first, planned to display nonchalance and indifference, but her granddaughter's reaction made keeping that facade difficult. As such, she could only calmly say these words. However, it was as though Mistress Fardan hadn't heard them at all. "Maltalia, I see you've come within quite a few weeks. I assume that your precious granddaughter is participating?" Athri's expression wavered with some apprehension. Not only did she know that the answer was no, but she actually showed a hint of fear at the prospect. It was hard to imagine that there could be a woman more useless. "Who is participating from my oligarch family has nothing to do with you." Mistress Olidark was beginning to lose her patience, but Mistress Fardan only continued to laugh lightly. "So these boys? I remember that your family's men didn't have strong seed, so they could only birth weak women, so these must be the new recruits you've scrounged up? A few more impotent orphans to birth more weak women for your family? How long do you think that cycle can continue?" Mistress Olidark's expression darkened. Sebastian looked as though his head was about to fly from his shoulders when he heard this, but Slayton continued to smile without a word. He didn't seem to be capable of reacting with anything else. At that moment, Lionel yawned. "Are we going to stand here all day? This conversation is boring." For maybe the first time, Mistress Olidark felt grateful for words Lionel had spoken. "Boring, indeed," she said lightly. "You three enter the city now. The hopes of the Olidark family will be on your shoulders." Kivire seemed to finally shift from her baseline, her gaze shifting toward Lionel. But he never looked at her from start to finish. The young heiress of the Fardan family, Valra, narrowed her eyes when she looked at Lionel, but by that point, he and the others were already moving toward the city. At the same time, Mistress Olidark, her granddaughter, and the elders had already eagerly returned to the large bird, prepared to leave for a new destination. Valra. "Yes, grandmother. Kill the three of them when there's an opportunity. You too, support her." "Yes, mistress." Kiver's eyes narrowed. There was something odd about that boy. It was best to kill him while he was still in the beginning stages of the 6th star. As for the other two, the hate between the Fardan and Olidarks was already irreconcilable. It was best to cripple their next generation entirely. Chapter 1536. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 1536. Shock and silence. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The inside of the city was unlike what Lionel had expected. Or, it was more accurate to say that this so-called gathering was completely unlike what he expected. He could sense several force arts in the surroundings designed purely for monitoring. This meant that they were being watched from all sides. Lionel concluded that since Mistress Olidark and the others hadn't followed them into the city, they were using this method instead to check for progress. Lionel had expected a tournament of some sort, but what he got instead was probably akin to hell on earth. When they entered the city, they found themselves enveloped by a bubble of energy. All around them was what looked like a normal city with stores, residences, and even sky rises. However, the issue was that all of these things were surrounded by demons. Every group that entered the city was given a protective bubble of energy and could only watch in horror as large numbers of demons tried to scratch and claw at them, only to fail. It suddenly became very obvious that this protective bubble and the tall city walls didn't exist to protect those from the outside from coming in. Rather, it was the exact opposite. They were designed to keep these demons in. In fact, when Lionel turned back, he couldn't even see the city walls any longer. Just like when he had entered the demon world, it was as though he had entered an all-new space completely separate from the outside world. At that moment, an automated message played in Lionel's mind explaining the proceedings. Then, with an unceremonious pop, his energy bubble vanished and he was dropped into a sea of demons. Lionel raised an eyebrow as several demons swept at him. They were clearly only low-class demons and didn't pose much of a threat to him, but there were several others around Lionel who were instantly overwhelmed, being unceremoniously shredded to pieces. Lionel dodged out of the way of a claw and stepped forward at the same time. His arm shot forward parallel to the arm of a wolf-man demon and his fingers tapped its forehead. In one moment, the wolf-man was just fine, but in the next, its head was shredded to pieces. It was as though Lionel didn't need to try to kill low-class demons in the slightest. The strongest demon Lionel had faced until this point was the unicorn demon, and it was a middle low-class demon. Back then, he had been forced to use 30% of strength. And, against the lower low-class demons, he probably had to use 10%. Now, against the lower low-class demon, he didn't even have to bring out his spear, let alone use so much strength. According to the voice that Lionel had just heard, the city was actually divided into bubble classes. Because they were middle-class participants, they were directly transported to the middle-class region. This city was filled with nothing but participants, and demons were their currency. Only by killing demons could they buy safety, rest, food and resources. In addition, if they performed extremely well, rather than just making enough to survive until the time period, they could exchange exactly this currency they had made for special prizes that would bolster their strength. The names of the participants would be ranked on a leaderboard, and the cities with the best performing triplet teams would gain prizes directly from the 4 great families. These were the rewards the cities and the families that controlled them were most looking forward to. These prizes would include relief from the great families, immunity from lottery draws to be drafted to needed areas, and a larger quota of resources for the next coming years. It was the first time that the 4 great families were doing such a thing, but even if it was the first time, it made those hopefuls no less wanting. It was no wonder Mistress Olidark was willing to swallow her grievances and put forward the best candidates. If she could bring her husband and son-in-law back home, then suffering a small bit of disrespect from Lionel wasn't a big deal at all. Lionel's eyes glowed. As expected, this was a great opportunity. The prizes the cities would get weren't intriguing to him. After all, they were designed to only be useful to large powers to begin with. The prizes that he could earn himself by using and spending his demon points was a different matter entirely. Lionel completely ignored Slayton and Sebastian, not even trying to team up with them like the other groups had. He had no interest in such things, they would only drag him down. In addition, there was very clearly a hidden rule here that most would be eyeing. Killing demons would get your demon points. But so would killing those with the demon points to begin with. Lionel had no way of knowing what Mistress Olidark had secretly whispered into their ears, but he had no plans to give his back to these people to protect. Lionel didn't believe for an instant that Mistress Olidark had left him in the dark about the rules by accident. Lionel's absolute spear domain flourished to life, shredding apart every demon that stepped without 5 meters of him. His pace of killing was mind-numbing. In just a few seconds, he had already left those that had spawned with him in the dust. There was something else about these rules that greatly intrigued Lionel as his ranking quickly shot up. It emphasized that he had been spawned into the middle-class region. Did that mean that there was a chance to exchange his demon points to enter a higher region? And if there was, he had a feeling that there would be even better prizes to exchange for there. In a location high in the sky, floating in a cloud above, a gathering of elders, family heads, and organization heads came together. Several leaderboards could be seen and various groups found their own and intently focused on it. Best on the side, several screens of live action played, but they mostly focused on high rankers or interesting life and death situations. When the new arrivals came, without pause, they all moved forward to greet the same man sitting high on a throne. He had a head of vibrant blue hair and just as blue eyes, his aura wafting outward in suffocating waves. Everything about his air screams majestic and mighty, not to mention impregnable. Mistress Olidark bowed lowly and paid her respects. After a few seconds she raised her head and turned away. The man never acknowledged any of them, but this was already to be expected. What wasn't expected, though, was that if Lionel was here he would have been shocked and silent. His mind would spin, unable to quite compute what he was seeing. Whether it was the hair, the eyes, even down the exact aura, this man was a perfect replica. It was impossible for it to be a coincidence. But the question was, what was a member of the Aderna family of Earth doing in a mythological zone like this? Chapter 1537. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1537. Next victim. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. There were over 30,000 participants in the middle class sector from over 10,000 cities, families, and organizations. Maybe it was because the great families didn't care for the lower classes all that much, or maybe they just couldn't be bothered to care about perfect fairness. But Lionel and the others had only entered after already about 80% of the coming participants had done so. Even so, in just a few seconds, Lionel leapt through thousands of ranks from lower than 32,000, all the way up to 19,000. He wasn't the first to have such an enormous leap among the middle classes, but this was still large enough of a leap to cause one of the many monitors to suddenly focus on him. Mistress Olidark and the others who were paying a great amount of attention to the middle class immediately spotted this. But when they saw that Lionel was alone, unlike most of the others, their expressions immediately became ugly. This was the middle class sector. Even though the front was loaded with lower class demons, it wouldn't remain like this for long. Very quickly, Lionel would run into middle lower class demons and higher. Eventually, true middle class demons would appear and a single group wouldn't be enough. Mistress Olidark's face went completely dark. She knew why Lionel had done this. He didn't trust Sebastian or Slayton. It wasn't that she hadn't thought of this possibility, but she thought that in choosing between a potential risk to his life and a certain death, Lionel would choose the former. Anyone would choose the former. It seemed, though, that she had underestimated Lionel's stubbornness. Things would still be fine if only Lionel died, but now that he was gone it left the other two vulnerable. It was very likely that because of one Lionel, her whole Olidark family would be ruined. Back in the sector, Sebastian and Slayton were already gritting their teeth. Even the usually calm and smiling Slayton had a gaze that dimmed a considerable amount. They had tried to call out to Lionel, but it was as though he hadn't heard a single word they said. The unfortunate truth was that Lionel was right to directly ignore them. Mistress Olidark had already informed them that once the events died down and they secured a safe house, that they were to find a chance to directly kill Lionel and take his point. In fact, Slayton had put in a little extra effort to get closer to Lionel as well during the ride here. However, neither expected that Lionel would disregard his own safety to spite them. It was like Lionel was dragging them toward death. If he was going to die, then they could all die together. Sebastian and Slayton both turned serious as they felt a subtle trio of gazes land on them. They didn't need to look over to know that it was the Fardan family participants. The two were still talents in their own rights and they immediately understood the situation they were in. They didn't even dare to allow the Fardans to realize they had noticed their intent, feigning ignorance. It was best to remain as far away from open hostility until they could settle down. Their gazes flashed with a cold light as they looked off toward where Lionel had disappeared before buckling down and fending off the wave of demons. They weren't as foolish as Lionel. They knew how important it was to conserve their strength. Lionel shot through the demons, his spear force shredding everything in its path. He could already guess what all of them were thinking, but he didn't mind it. In fact, he found it a bit amusing. Stamina. With how well his vital stars and dream force stars worked now, he would probably grow bored of even a life and death struggle before his stamina gave way. Plus, even if that wasn't the case, he was hardly using any of his strength right now, which also meant that Mistress Olidark's worries about middle-class demons would also fall on deaf ears. Lionel's goal wasn't even this place. If the middle-class sector didn't have what he needed, he would kill enough demons to exchange a pass to enter the high-class sector. If that wasn't enough, he would enter the human class sector. As far as he was concerned, there was nothing here that could threaten him. At the same time, this place was also the opportunity he needed to finish the final stretch of the 2 weeks that remained of his plans ahead of schedule, so he didn't even care much about revealing a bit more of his strength either. Regardless, after he left this place, he wouldn't be returning to the oligarch family. 1 point per 5 lower low-class demons, 1 per 2 middle low-class demons and 1 per higher low-class demon. The numbers could get annoying. It would be better to target middle-class demons. P1 E's Visi, T, Nov 1B, in. Ni, T there was a huge jump for middle-class demons, 10 demon points for lower, 100 for middle, and 1,000 for higher. That was where the big money was, and it was also probably why Lionel's jump in rankings was so slow after he crossed below the 20,000 mark. Ah, that's where you've been hiding. A smile spread across Lionel's face as he spotted his first middle-class demon. Those that had been watching in a cloud above the city wore weird expressions. Many who had a relationship with the oligarch family had already made the connection since the name Lionel Oligarch was on display for all to see. Those who had good relationships with the family looked toward the mistress with pitying expressions, but many more laughed and sneered. Didn't it show a lack of foresight to allow such a youth to participate in such an important event? But it wasn't long before those smiles froze. Lionel shot toward the low middle-class demon like a bulldozer. He didn't even levy an attack, just letting his absolute spear domain rip it apart. Flesh worth its weight in gold fell to the ground in a rain, but Lionel didn't seem to care about it in the slightest. He shot forward, looking for his next victim as though nothing had happened. Chapter 1538. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 1538. Sky rises if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Mistress Oligarch stood frozen. After a long while, she released a self-deprecating laugh. She realized right then that one way or another, the Oligarch family was finished. She had underestimated Lionel. With this level of talent, how could the Morales family not have been at least a high-class family? In that case, so long as Lionel rose high enough, he would catch the attention of the enemies that had destroyed it. Once they saw the name Oligarch, even if they didn't act now, in the future her family would find itself facing an unknown behemoth. Even if by some miracle Lionel passed under the radar, overperforming to this extent would net him too much power. With Lionel's personality, he would hesitate to betray them and come back in the future for revenge. And, to make matters even worse, even if Lionel was still overestimating himself and he ended up dying, Sebastian and Slayton weren't far from following in his footsteps. One way or another, no matter how she flipped and analyzed it, they were finished. Lionel zipped around, finding every middle-class demon he could and shredding them to pieces. His ranking continued to shoot up by large strides, from 19,000 to 15,000, and then from 15,000 to 12,000. It had only been several minutes since he entered, but he had already accumulated over 300 demon points. This city is so large, it feels like a world of its own. Before I make any other moves, I should check these shops to see what's going on. Lionel chose a random shop, blasted the demons around away and tried to enter. Immediately, he was greeted with a message. It told him the level of the shop, the entry fee, and how long he could stay inside. This was the lowest level shop, but it still cost 3 demon points just to enter. You would have to kill 15 lower class demons just for the right to enter a low-level shop for 15 minutes. It could be said that this was definitely a hell on earth. If Lionel had entered this place before entering the 6th dimension, he would definitely be struggling with these requirements. It required so much just to enter, so how much would the things inside cost? The first shop Lionel entered was actually an exchange. It could convert demon corpses into force pills that could have a myriad of effects. Some gave temporary boosts in strength, some healed injuries, and some could have small but permanent effects on your power. P1 E's Visi, T, Nov 1B, in. Ni, T this was just the lowest level shop, so it could only do this for low-class demons. Lionel exited the shop after he was done and continued on his killing spree until he found another to enter, checking them all one by one. As he entered these shops, Lionel's rank didn't fall. If one had to choose between spending their points or hoarding them, there wouldn't be much of a benefit to families. Instead, spent points and hoarded points split into two categories. At the end of the event, hoarded points would be increased by 50% while spent points would be worth the same. That was the only incentive to hoard your points. That said, most would choose to spend when they had a chance in the beginning to strengthen themselves as much as possible, and then during the final days go all out to gather as many hoarded points as possible. After an analysis, Lionel split the shop into several categories. The first shop was a conversion-type shop, essentially helping one to gain even more benefits from their demon hunting. The second shop type was the weapon shop, the third was the technique shop, the fourth was resource shops, and the final was the healing shop. These were all the lowest class, though. As Lionel moved up, he finally crossed a threshold. Not only were there more middle-class demons, but this was the point where residents, or safe houses, appeared. The lowest level of safe house only allowed you to enter and rest for a certain period of time. The higher the class, the more benefits and amenities there were. Many provided food, at a higher level they doubled as healing shops, and at the highest, they even came with large concentrations of force that allowed you to increase your strength. This final level, though, was only left to the sky rises in the distance, which would be considered Lionel's main goal. The resource shops that Lionel had seen until now didn't have anything that moved them. They had low-class herbs and ores, but nothing on the list of things Lionel needed. The last chance Lionel had were the sky rises. If they didn't have it, he would definitely need to buckle down and gather the 100,000 demon points he would need to enter the high class. By the time Lionel made it, he had already entered the top 1,000, forcing the middle-class leaders into a state of numbness as they stared ahead. However, the higher he climbed, the more despair Mistress Olidark felt. She sank into her seat, her face a ghastly sheen of white and her wrinkled hands trembling. A lack of stamina? Even after an hour Lionel hadn't sweat even a single bead. Worry about middle-class demons? Shouldn't they be worried about him? Everything from earlier seemed so laughable. Lionel shot into the first sky rise, paying the 1,000 demon point fee and gaining a day-long entry. He looked around, finding several gazes suddenly landing on him. The elite of the middle-class cities were surprised by a new entry, especially since they didn't recognize who he was. But Lionel didn't care for them even a bit. He was on a time crunch. This event wouldn't last forever, so he had to do his best with the time he had. Without hesitation, he entered the first shop, his gaze sharpening as he scanned the items one by one. Chapter 1539. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 34 seconds p.m. Chapter 1539. Top prize if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The items here were most definitely better than what he could find outside, and the refinement shops could refine even high-class demons. Not that you'd find any here. But the breathing room still allowed for the force pills you received in return to be of higher quality and greater yield. Lionel was absolutely certain that this was at least a gold grade zone, or else there wouldn't be so many powerful individuals here. So, he was also certain that he could take things out as well even if it wasn't a unique zone, not that he was quite certain of this either. As such, Lionel wasn't just on the lookout for the materials he needed, but he was also looking for things that might be of interest to him. In a mythological zone like this one, not only were there bound to be a new magic system, but there would also be new technologies the real world wouldn't have. For example, Camelot had used crystal balls to store and exchange information. Although the Void Palace had something similar with their pendants, it still wasn't exactly the same. Plus, it also had to be considered that Camelot's zone was very low level compared to the Void Palace. The fact they could form even a similar technology was highly impressive. And it confirmed that a high-level zone like this one would most definitely have something even more impressive. Lionel just needed to find it. Lionel chose to ignore the refinement shops for now, as demons of this level weren't very useful to him. He had already simulated it, and his body was much too powerful to benefit even from these higher-yield force pills. It would likely require one refined from the body of a human-class demon before there was any substantial change. Techniques also weren't very interesting to Lionel. With his grandfather's methods, he didn't feel the need to focus on them. He could create his own with combinations of words. In addition, one day he'd be able to reclaim the segmented cube, so the techniques hidden within the bronze tablet would supplement his starry-tailed fox lineage factor. This was all on top of the fact the Morales family had a copious amount of techniques perfect for their lineage factor, not to mention Lionel's self-created, star fusion. And of course, Lionel had learned his lesson. He no longer felt like it was right to bother with other force accumulation techniques when Dimensional Cleanse had so many secrets that he had yet to tap into. So, Lionel focused mainly on resources. He was also in great need of a top-class bow and arrows. Nothing on the first floor met his standards, so he immediately went up, paying the fees without batting an eye. If there was anything that he couldn't afford, he would simply go back and earn the demon points he needed to exchange for it. The geniuses on the first floor couldn't help but look toward one another. Even they felt the pinch shooting up like floors like that. That was why they had stayed on the first floor to rest. But Lionel had just entered and didn't even hesitate. Check the rankings. Are there any names you don't recognize? P1 E's Vizzy, T, Nov 1B, In. Ni, T, there, at 671st, Olidark? That family that can't produce any heirs? That should be him, but it's not adding up. They shouldn't have anyone that powerful. 671st is still manageable. It's not enough to be worried about gaining the top prize. But judging by how he's spending his points right now, he doesn't seem to care very much at all. He's likely very confident that he can climb much higher. He came alone and he's completely uninjured. He's definitely a threat. The gazes of the geniuses grew serious. The top prize was something most of them were getting for, even though they were aware that it was unlikely for them to get it. The idea of one more competitor left them uneasy, especially since the context clues seemed to tell them that Lionel was formidable. Unlike the other prizes, landing the top prize would be a qualitative change for most here. In fact, it would be enough to go from a middle-class genius to a high-class and maybe even human class depending on how compatible they were with it. The unfortunate part was that the top prize wasn't guaranteed to be handed out. Even first place on the rankings wasn't guaranteed to get it. In order to land the prize, what you needed wasn't points, you needed a certain percentage of kills. Eventually, the demons would stop spawning once all participants were present and all of the low-class demons had been cleared, a number would appear. For their middle-class region, the only way to land the prize was to be personally responsible for the death of 10% of the demons. 10%. There were easily hundreds of thousands of demons in this city with them. The idea of killing such a number of middle-class demons on your own was absolutely ridiculous. Many could only curse the great families in their hearts, but they still kept their thoughts to themselves. Who dared to speak ill of the great families in their world? Doing so was tantamount to suicide. The shield that protected them from chaos demons wasn't to be blasphemed. Lionel didn't have any idea about what the youths were talking about. Because Mistress Olidark had kept him in the dark about a lot of things, he only really understood the basic rules that the automated voice had spoken into his mind. However, he still quickly jumped from shop to shop until he found a decent enough bow that he exchanged 10,000 demon points for. This so-called decent bow was actually exceptionally powerful. It was just that after using the White Lion bow, Lionel's standards had shot up tremendously. Still, it was a great silver-grade bow that came with the function of self-created arrows with power based on how much bow force you poured into it. Under the confused gazes of the Olidark family who thought him to be a spearman, he strapped it to his back and ascended to the penthouse floor of the Sky Rise. But what he found there left him absolutely frozen in shock. A bronze tablet, shimmering behind a protective formation, hovered in the air. The words on its surface all too familiar to Lionel. Chapter 1540. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 32 seconds p.m. Chapter 1540. Uncertainty. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. A union of light and darkness will reveal the 12-pointed star. There was only one place that Lionel had seen these words before, the Luxnix family's bronze tablet. The very same bronze tablet that was responsible for the Luxnix family's lineage factor, that was responsible for Lionel's current starry-tailed fox lineage factor. However, this one was different. Completely different. It looked exactly the same. Had exactly the same words. Radiated the same colors. And yet Lionel had a nagging feeling in his heart that it wasn't the same at all, that it couldn't have been more different, that it was even directly opposite and opposing him. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, his expression returning to its baseline focus state. He knew in his heart that he had already decided to go all out for this tablet, even if it required delaying his movement toward the high class. It was simply too important. If Lionel was correct about this feeling, this tablet was the other half. It didn't provide the side of light, but rather, the side of darkness. Lionel had no idea why it would be here or how this world was related to the tablets, but the more he learned and found out, the more confused he became. Even his mind couldn't wrap around exactly what was happening. Lionel chose the only method he could and finally read the introduction. But to his disappointment, it didn't give him what he needed. However, after getting over his disappointment, Lionel's eyes glowed. According to the introduction, what you saw here would be whatever you needed the most. Apparently, what everyone saw here would be different to guarantee the quality and value of the top prize. The trouble was that after reading into the fine print, the prize wasn't guaranteed to be useful to you either. If you, say, already had the lineage factor, the limitations of a middle-class top prize wouldn't allow you to gain the silver tablet you needed to continue. This meant that the best you could hope for here was a bronze tablet. But it was also curious for another reason. This didn't guarantee that Lionel would be able to use the tablet either. From his conversations with Wise Star Order, Lionel had learned that just having the tablet wasn't enough to gain the lineage factor within it. You had to have a certain level of affinity for it to begin with, only then would you be able to resonate with the tablet and gain what was within it. This was why you couldn't just immediately leap to the greatest lineage factor within the tablet, and it was also the reason why the likes of Miguel gained so much more than most others from meditating upon the tablet as well. Resonance mattered. Lionel was a bit unfortunate in this respect. This system seemed to register that this tablet would resonate well with him, but that was only because it happened to be a pair with its light force counterpart. And, since Lionel had already reached the peak of the lineage factors the light star bronze tablet could give him, the system wouldn't give him that bronze tablet either. Lionel could make up for his lack of affinity with his divine armor, but he had already switched his aim once already. If he switched it again it would make his foundation shaky. And right now, dark force was only a secondary affinity he gained from his armor, making it even weaker. Lionel didn't believe he had the resonance necessary to make this tablet react to him at all. But it didn't matter, he definitely needed it. The tablets were something that Lionel was endlessly fascinated by. He knew that there was a secret behind them that he'd only be able to reveal if he collected as many as possible. These tablets could allow breakthrough, grant lineage factors, give ability indexes, and even resurrect the dead. If Lionel didn't get to the bottom of this, he could forget about ever reaching the pinnacle of the dimensional verse. In fact, he had a feeling that the secret behind this was the very key to doing so. 10%, huh? I didn't plan on going so hard in the middle-class sector, but it seems I'll need to unleash a bit of carnage. Lionel left the top floor and paid for residence. There was no point in going out right now. Very soon, the low-class demons would all be killed and the final phase would begin. When that happened, he would have to act as fast as possible, finishing it all in a single sweep. Lionel found a bed and collapsed into it. He wasn't very tired as he had hardly done much, but he closed his eyes anyway, allowing the dense force to seep into his pores. What he didn't know was that at that moment, he finally caught the attention of the Aderna family man sitting on the throne. The man had not shown any reaction whatsoever from start to finish, even while he watched the geniuses of the Fiend class display power the likes of which would wipe out many of the city leaders here. However, when he saw the tablet that appeared for Lionel, his pupils constricted into pinholes. The man stood abruptly, vanishing with a speed none present could track. Who allowed those the 12-pointed star tablets into the selection process? Oh. You realized? How could I not realize? Someone has summoned them. The voice on the other end suddenly perked up. Really? Are you taking this as a joke? The voice paused for a moment before it spoke again. This isn't a decision that can be interfered with. Let alone the 12-pointed star, the Emperor's Might tablets have also been placed inside. The world has spent too long without these star forces, and the chaos demons are growing more powerful. If they don't appear again soon, the human race will be finished. Do you take me for a fool? Who do you think destroyed them in the first place? Watch your tone. These aren't things that should be said aloud, or even you will lose your head. The blue-haired man seemed to realize that he had said too much and he fell into silence, but his eyes still blazed with uncertainty. Chapter 1541. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1541. Arraign if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Seeing the silence of the blue-haired man, the voice grew gentler. It was clear that whoever this individual of the Aderna family was, his standing was not small, or else the voice wouldn't even bother to show such courtesy. This isn't the only place we've allowed those tablets to spread, and we are currently heavily monitoring their activity. Some risks need to be taken. They were destroyed years ago because their threat was too enormous, but it's precisely their strength that we need now. The blue-haired man opened his mouth to speak, but he held back, shaking his head. It seemed that history had a tendency to repeat itself. Those families had been destroyed long ago, but it seemed that their families wanted to bring them back in a controlled fashion by spreading the lineage factors among the common folk. To the blue-haired man, even the geniuses of the fiend rank could only be considered as such. The chasm between them and the great families was simply far too large. However, if these common folk were given these tablets, the change to their destiny would be far too great. Who was to say those families wouldn't rise up again? Just thinking about it logically, it made no sense. If those who managed to get their hands on these lineage factors were restrained enough that they could be controlled and managed, how would they be able to help against chaos demons the great families couldn't deal with? And, if they were unleashed enough to grow powerful enough to deal with matters the great families could not, then how would their four families keep control of them at all? No matter how you looked at it, it felt like they were dropping a stone on their own feet while seeing it through all the way and not even attempting to dodge. It was a recipe for disaster, and the four great families could be greatly shaken by this like they once had been in the past. The higher-ups aren't fools, Avras. They know what they're doing. The Dream Project will be the key to it all, and the results are forthcoming. In as little as 1 to 200 years, it will be completed and the result will be apparent for all to see. Avra's brows jumped when he heard Dream Project. The words alone seemed to settle his nerves, and his understanding grew by a large measure. As for what those two words represented, maybe only the highest echelon of this world knew. You heard the snap that rang out that day just like I did, Avras. However, what you don't know is that eighth barrier to the chaos bubble shattered along with it. We don't have much time left, some chances have to be taken. Now go and do your duty. Don't allow anyone to see a crack in the shield of the great families. Avras shook from head to toe when he heard these words, but he clenched his jaw to stop himself, his gaze turning cold. Then, he turned and vanished, reappearing on his throne as though nothing had happened. Lionel had no idea what was happening and what the tablets truly represented, but his eyes snapped open just the same. It seemed that it was time. He jumped up, his gaze already cold as he regained his absolute focus. He flashed out of his residence. This one trip had already cut down his demon points by more than half, but he didn't seem to care. What he was about to do was going to give him more demon points than he could even spend in the middle-class zone. Lionel appeared on the first floor, several eyes focusing on him. However, he planned to ignore them all until his footsteps suddenly came to a halt. His gaze flashed, landing on a group of 3 young men in the corner. Their auras were so much more powerful than anyone else here that his gaze narrowed. Without even having to think, Lionel knew immediately what was happening. If even the likes of Sebastian and Slayton could have insider information, how could other, much higher class families, not? If Lionel ran one of these families and wanted to maximize his chances, he just might send some of his geniuses to forcefully snatch the quotas of some weaker families. It was clear that the four great families were making some kind of push. For what, Lionel didn't know. But it didn't particularly matter to him. Very soon, he would be leaving this place. Lionel suddenly grinned at the trio. The provocation in his expression was impossible to hide. He didn't know why, but he suddenly couldn't control the urge. His bow flew from his back and into his hand as though it had a mind of his own, and he shot outside. The trio of young men's eyes sharpened. They burst into action, shooting out in a whirl of force. By the time they did so, their heads could only shoot up to find Lionel soaring through into the skies, his leaping strength beyond what they could fathom. A roar left Lionel's lips, his dream force stars whirling to life as his internal sight expanded so far that it nearly blanketed the entire city. At the same, his bow force spurred, blanketing the surroundings in a suffocating six-dimensional aura. It suddenly felt to everyone in the city that no matter where they tried to hide, Lionel's arrow would strike true. Lionel landed on the top of the highest sky rise, pulling his bowstring taut. The strength flooding through his body was unlike anything he had experienced before. This was the first time he would let loose a bit since he stepped foot into the sixth dimension. But the feeling of being able to use the full power of his bow force without restraint was what truly made him feel like he was walking on air. Those watching were soon to witness something they could never fathom. A violet tsunami of enlightened bow force gathered, forming an arrow so resplendent that it shone like the sun and so powerful it forced the air to quake. Lionel's stance suddenly shifted, pointing his bow straight up before releasing. Like a flashbang, the arrow reached its high point before exploding, a rain of thousands of arrows falling down like a rain. One by one, just as many middle-class demons were pierced through. Chapter 1542. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1542. All if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's bow force seemed to have a life of its own, treating the lives of middle-class demons as though they were made up of nothing more than wet tissue paper. The feeling of finally being able to unleash his bow force without the support of external items made Lionel feel as though he was floating on a cloud. Every time he pulled his bowstring back, his grin grew wider and the light in his eyes only seemed to grow brighter. The eyes of the trio that had followed after him went wide and the elders that were watching fell into a deep silence. This was still just the middle class, but the power Lionel was displaying was clearly well beyond that. The challenge for the top prize wasn't meant to be cleared so easily. In fact, there was no guarantee that it would be claimed at all. If there was no one worthy, then the prize would simply return to the great families. It was that simple. However, at the pace Lionel was going, it looked as though he might succeed in as little as 10 minutes. And there was no one more clear about this than the youths below. The trio grit their teeth. Stop him. We'll have to kill him first, then secure the top prize. The moment one of them spoke what was already on their minds, they sprung into action, a flurry of lightning erupting around them. Lionel noticed their movement immediately, but he still launched 2 more shots into the air, slaughtering hundreds more. At that moment, the trio appeared around him in a triangular formation, arcs of lightning connecting them. They pressed their hands together, their eyes sparking with a golden light as they pushed out, 3 lightning lances forming around Lionel all at once. This formation was something that they had prepared to deal with large amounts of middle-class demons all at once. In fact, using this lightning would expose their true identities as being descendants of the high-class organization, the Lightning Lance Pavilion. However, it was clear that they didn't care. An open secret was still a secret. Everything had already been perfectly calculated. However, just when they thought they could skewer Lionel from 3 sides, his absolute spear domain appeared, shredding their lightning lances to pieces. It treated one of their most powerful attacks as though they were paper thin. Lionel's hair danced in the air, a cool smile on his face. He didn't even deem it necessary to use his ability index on these people. Right this moment, he just wanted a bit of fun. His bow flashed, seemingly appearing on his back as though it had a mind on his own. With his free hand, he pierced forward with 2 fingers toward one of them. The moment his second hand recovered from putting his bow away, it too pierced forward. But the speed was so fast that it felt as though they had both acted simultaneously. Swift. The golden lines of spear force appeared before two of the trio in the blink of an eye. Their eyes could only widen, their hearts leaping into their throats. Lightning armor. The two roared out simultaneously, one blue armor and another colored more violet appearing. Bang! Bang! The two shot backward and off the roof of the sky rise, crashing into opposing buildings without the ability to stop themselves. Lionel's body had already completed a half-spin before he even saw his attacks land, gathering the momentum into a strong punch that caused the air to pop. The third member of the trio could only react in the very same way, his armor slightly tinged red. But he was sent flying backward just as easily. Lionel's body was so powerful that just the wind pressure of his strike alone made him cough up a mouthful of blood, and the force powering it nearly shattered his body apart. Lionel paused for a moment as the three shot through the city, their bodies wreaking havoc. Lightning armor? The name wasn't very unique and he had seen similar techniques before. But it felt so similar to his own divine armor. Of course, it didn't use earth force. But everything from the runes to the converging system to form an armor seemed all too similar. In fact, each of them even had a slightly different tinge or color, showing that they could follow their own paths just like he could. Interesting. Lionel smiled. His bow appeared in his hand once again, his arrows becoming even faster. The terror he rained made it look like he was the demon rather than the other way around. He relished in it, a feeling unleashing in his heart that tinged his irises red. His white bow force seemed to become tinged by the crimson energy as well, becoming more forceful and more powerful. Every time one landed, it would be as though a landmine had imploded within there. Head would be shredded apart like watermelon, chests would be split open, and entire limbs and shoulders would vanish into a swirl of crimson, never to reform themselves again. The trios looked up, shattered glass, metal, brick and stone laying around them. Their gazes flashed with rage. A mere middle-class genius had done this to them? The humiliation was more than they could stomach. However, they had been given a mission by their organization. The most powerful three of them had, of course, been sent to the high-class sector. The three of them could be considered to be 4th through 6th in ranking. But even with that being the case, they were supposed to have this victory guaranteed. They couldn't allow this to happen. All of you, one of them roared. Attack together now or else we'll personally kill you all. The roar shook the spectators awake, even those that were still struggling to make it toward the center of the city. When the Fardens, along with Sebastian and Slayton, saw who the target was, their eyes flashed and they shot forward along with everyone else. Chapter 1543. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1543. Reconcilable if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's eyes narrowed as he drew his bowstring back again. He didn't feel threatened. He could take these people out with just a bit more effort than he took out the middle-class demons. The problem was that he knew he was being monitored and if he slaughtered all the geniuses of these organizations and families, leaving this place would be difficult. Lionel had already learned enough about these sorts of words to know that fairness and logic was only a thing you could demand when you had powerful enough backing. Back in the Milky Way, no one knew what kind of backing he had, so he faced trouble everywhere he went. The Luxnix family had underestimated the kind of power his father held, so he had suffered at their hands as a baby. It wasn't until he reached the Void Palace where everyone knew who he was that he received the treatment someone of his stature should. Now he was in a completely different world, one that had never heard of the Morales name and seemed even more powerful than the world he knew even if they somehow had. These individuals weren't people he could afford to lightly offend without worrying about the consequences. Consider yourselves lucky, Lionel thought to himself. His back tightened again, his bowstring being pulled taut only to release another flurry of arrows. Lionel knew that it wasn't just about the top prize. Most of these people knew that they couldn't get it. The first issue was fear of the Lightning Lance Pavilion trio. These people were even more familiar with this world than Lionel was, so they likely knew that there were such people hidden in the shadows, breaking the rules. The second was Lionel's point. Getting 10% was one matter, but the point total that would entail was beyond their wildest imaginations. In just a few moments, Lionel had already shot up to first place, and the gap he was putting between himself and everyone else only seemed to be increasing by leaps and bounds. A tide of geniuses surged toward Lionel along with demons. Demons, especially in the middle class, already had intelligence of their own. They could tell who the biggest threat was here, and they didn't even bother to attack anyone else as they shot for Lionel. At that moment, the trio finally rose to their feet, roaring. 3 total stars appeared. The geniuses of the middle class couldn't help but gawk when they saw this. Star manifestation. These 3 could actually manifest their stars into the real world. Much like their armors, one was sparking with red lightning, another with blue, and the last with violet. They all had their own force stars, and with their appearances, their strength shot to another level, large waves of force surging toward them. They shot forward, coming for Lionel with their minds on a singular focus: to kill. Lionel made it easy on them, not moving a single inch as they approached. He continued to kill demons in large hordes, his bow force seemingly endless and relentless as the crimson in his irises smoldered with a hidden heat. Lionel held his bow in one hand, his right palm flipping over to reveal a black spear wreathed in chains. His gaze flashed, his foot took a strong step forward as he pierced outward. The sound and tearing paper sounds as the wind split apart, a dazzling golden light streaking across the skies, and appeared before the young man with a violet star hovering to his back. The young man was ready, a large amount of violet lightning forming around his fist until he had suddenly forward an enormous violet lance which had dancing runes on its surface. The collision was enormous. However, while his momentum stopped, he wasn't sent flying backward again, his feet leaving heavy cracks in the concrete as he stomped backward to stop himself. Lionel pierced out twice more, his spear, his powerful actions which easily swept across hundreds of meters seeming to be as casual as breathing. Right at the moment, like the breath of a reaper, a shadow appeared to his back. The silhouette was lithe and slender, not to mention explosive and powerful. It was no doubt a woman, and a well-trained assassin at that. However, Lionel only sidestepped once, his spear vanishing from his hand as his claw shot out. Lionel hardly completed his turn when he felt soft flesh collide solidly with his palm, the bobbing of a throat and strained breathing traveling up his arm. When he finally looked, he found that his hand was clamped around the throat of a young woman he recognized, the young heiress of the Fardan family. But when he looked at her, he didn't seem to feel like she was anything special at all. This young woman was most definitely not used to being stared at in such an indifferent way, but it made her body tense up, all her skills and training vanishing. It felt to her that Lionel wasn't even worried about what she could or might do. All of her efforts were worthless, and would also be worthless. Even if she suddenly grew 10 times more powerful, it would still be worthless. Lionel squeezed lightly. But what was light to him made Valra feel as though her spine was about to snap. Why even bother to do something so useless? Lionel tossed her off the side of the building, her body colliding with the 2 remaining hidden members of the Fardan family and causing all 3 to cough up several mouthfuls of blood. And you too especially. I won't kill the others, but you might as well die. Lionel pulled the string of his bow once more, yet it split in 2. Sebastian and Sladen, who were on the verge of joining in on the next attack, froze a moment. In one instant, they seemed fine. But in the next, their skulls imploded into a bloody rain. Lionel didn't seem to think much of this at all. He wouldn't bother with the others since there was no use in offending their backers. But he and the Olidark family were already irreconcilable. Chapter 1544. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 26 seconds p.m. Chapter 1544. Wild card: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What remained of the battle could only be described as a farce. Every time the trio built up momentum, they were stopped by a single spear strike. By the 3rd time this happened, they found themselves surrounded by demons, and making their way forward only became more and more challenging. While demons were smart enough to know who the real threat was, they were also a selfish race ruled by their greed. They could see how powerful Lionel was, and there was an easier target right here. Why not take advantage? Plus, if they could swallow powerful targets like the trio, they would find themselves with greater power to use to then deal with Lionel. As for those that weren't the trio, many had given up after the death of Sebastian and Slayton. The others that seemed to realize that Lionel didn't dare to kill them all, though, kept trying, only to find themselves even more unceremoniously dealt with than the trio. Soon, they realized that they were accumulating too many injuries, so much so that they were beginning to fall into the danger of dying not to Lionel, but the demons themselves. The elders in the clouds above watched in silence as Lionel crossed the 10% mark, something that had practically been inevitable from the very beginning. What a good little seedling you have, Miss of the Olidarch family. The terse voice came from an old man with a large nose. His eyes sparked with lightning from time to time, and he was without a doubt the head of the Lightning Lance Pavilion, Head Auburn. By now, everyone knew it was his disciples that had gone inside. But he still couldn't admit that, or else he would be forced to pay a steep price. Still, he could use this method to display his dissatisfaction to the greatest extent possible. Mistress Olidarch shuddered when she heard this. Things might still be fine if she could rely on Lionel to become a pillar of her family, but not many had realized that the two Lionel had killed were from her very own family. And, even if they had, they wouldn't think much of it. This was because others were well aware that there was competition in the Olidarch to become the son-in-law of the next generation. As such, they would just think that Lionel had acted in order to clear the path for himself in the future and get rid of trouble from the roots. Due to this, many believed that Lionel was acting under the orders of Mistress Olidarch and was her greatest trump card. Who cared about the loss of two middling talents when you had one that could crush even high-class talents? Thank you for your kind words, Pavilion Head Auburn. Head Auburn snorted, an action that was quite forceful considering the size of his nostrils, and turned away without another word. There wasn't much else that he could do about this matter even if he was dissatisfied. This was definitely a great loss for his pavilion. But there was still a chance at the high-class top prize. They had to get at least one. A new era was coming, and if they couldn't put a foot in the door, they would regret it for generations to come. This was an opportunity they had to grasp. Mistress Olidarch secretly clenched her fists. There was only one way out of this. But she had to take it, even if it required burning away generations of their accrued resources. A loss like this wasn't one they could handle. Sebastian and Slayton were two geniuses that she was greatly satisfied with, but Lionel made them look like trash by the roadside. Mpabo. Yes, ma'am. The words exchanged were heard by no one. But when they were finished, Mpabo's expression flickered before he slowly and respectfully left the cloud. He wasn't a member of the Aderna family, he could rudely display his strength here as he pleased. Lionel stood on the very top floor once again, his point total having climbed into the millions. However, the good thing about the top prize was that he didn't need to spend any of them. With a single reach forward with his hands, Lionel grabbed onto the bronze tablet, his body trembling. For some reason, it felt good in his hands. Lionel hesitated for a moment but eventually shook his head. He couldn't waste any more time. The final phase of the other sectors had likely already started or were close to. If he lagged behind any more, he would lose his chance. Although Lionel's top priority was gathering the resources he needed to succeed in his plan, if he could also lay his hands on the silver tablet, why wouldn't he? Lionel put the bronze tablet away to the astonishment of those watching, and his body vanished in a flicker. With a greater speed than he had displayed until now, those stuck in the middle class could only watch as he made it to the gates of the sector and exchanged 100,000 demon points for entry into the high class. Could he be planning what they all thought? Everyone shared the same idea. Usually, the top prize would be every one of Lionel's caliber's target. Once you got it, everything else paled in comparison. But the fact Lionel was continuing. Didn't that mean? The elders and youths sucked in a cold breath while the expression of the pavilion head darkened. The final phase is about to begin, rest up. We will move out soon. A youth with a dashing head of white hair spoke. His presence alone seemed to give off a radiant light force energy that made others want to worship him. This was the head disciple of the human class Sacred Light Palace. That was right. A human class power had not sent their 4th to 6th best here. Rather, they had sent the very best they had. However, at that moment, something that would astonish them all would happen. Stophier. Look at the ranking. Stophier frowned, wondering what all the commotion was about. But the moment he listened, his pupils constricted. Rank 17, Lionel Olidark, 3,028,719 demon points. That name had definitely not been there before. Could it be someone upgraded from the middle class with so many points? He would be ranked 11th with an extra 100,000 demon points, just outside the top 10. It seemed that another wild card had appeared. Lionel himself was in a state of shock as he looked at the leaderboard, suddenly becoming familiar with the reason why he was only another wild card. Rank 1, Aina Brazinger, 11,273,729 demon points. Chapter 1545. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 23 seconds p.m. Chapter 1545. Portals. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was only stunned for a moment before a huge grin spread across his face. It was unlikely that Aina would know it was him. After all, his last name had been changed and Lionel wasn't exactly an obscure name. However, even given that this city was easily 10 times as large as the already large one he had just been in, Lionel would definitely find her soon. He didn't quite understand why it was that Aina could use her force while everyone else couldn't, but he felt like the secret behind this was another clue to understand the secrets of this odd zone. Of course, it was also possible that his Aina was just that amazing, but that was his rosy glasses talking. There was definitely something deeper here. Lionel suddenly felt a lot lighter on his feet. Now that he was certain that Aina was okay, he only had to confirm his mother's safety and his mind would truly be free. Lionel was relatively more confident in his mother, though. Even if this world took away his mother's ability to use force, with her being so close to the 7th dimension, her body should be more than strong enough to handle herself in the wilderness. From what Lionel understood after meeting Miguel and Noah, though their force was locked away, the additional strength their bodies had gained while upgrading through the dimensions was not small at all. They were still able to use their bodies to hold their own and fight against the weaker enemies who couldn't find their place in the cities. Due to this, Lionel had been relatively less worried about his mother than Aina, who had yet to step into the 6th dimension. But given her current display of strength, Lionel was certain that she had taken that step just like he had. With a smile on his face, Lionel shot forward. He didn't care about anything else. First he would reunite with Aina. Together, they were far stronger. If they put their heads together, his plan, which would have been a bit difficult to accomplish at first, would almost become a breeze. In addition, he would be able to hide more of his strength if he was by Aina's side as well. After this event concluded, he would need to leave to find a secluded place to execute his plan. The more of his strength he showed before that, the more detrimental to their escape it would be. Mistress Olidark might not be the strongest 7th star there was, but she was still a 7th star. Lionel had to be very careful about how he handled her, and he still hadn't forgotten the brand on his shoulder blade. Very soon, he would burn it to ash, but he couldn't do so just yet. The reason for this was simple. Lionel would be naive to think that things would just end after he swept through these class sectors. Even if he spared their geniuses, there would be many organizations who still thought that it was only natural, as though he owed them something. It could be said that Lionel had spared their lives not because he thought it would definitely protect him, but rather to mitigate risk. Humans were complex creatures and there were bound to be some with consciences. It didn't make sense for him to accidentally offend such individuals and give them a reason to stab them in the back. As for those that were more shameless, Mistress Olidark would be his perfect cover. So long as it wasn't clear and obvious he had fallen out with Mistress Olidark, the morally superior side would be with the Olidark family. Lionel wasn't a fool. He felt that Mistress Olidark likely had a trump card or two that she hadn't used, or else she wouldn't dare send him into such a world of opportunity. While clinging to that trump card, she would fight tooth and nail to keep Lionel to her side, which would definitely benefit Lionel. With her thinking that she could still control him, things would become much simpler to handle, and even the so-called great families might step in to protect the order. Just the fact that these organizations that were breaking rules didn't dare to do so openly told Lionel all he needed to know about the kind of lines that were being towed. The great families might allow some underhanded methods, but they wouldn't allow outright cheating. This was the sort of mentality that bred the kind of dog-eat-dog world this was, but right now, that fine line was exactly what Lionel needed and was looking for. Lionel dodged out of the way of a black steed. With a single sidestep, his hand clamped down like a claw, a surge of spear force shredding its head into pieces. He was starting to get annoyed by these demons. If they weren't here, he would find Aina a lot quicker. This city is too large to just roam around aimlessly. I guess the best choice is just to charge toward the center. At that moment, Lionel's points began to take large leaps of hundreds of points at a time. The high-class sector geniuses didn't have so many more points than him because they were that much more powerful, but rather because the high-class demons in this place that they had the option to kill were worth far more demon points. Although Lionel also had to put in more effort and couldn't use his absolute spear domain to shred them apart anymore, at least not in his base form, the reward was also several times better anyway. Lionel swiftly crossed the 100,000 demon points that he had lost to make it here in the first place, every kill netting him at least 100 to 500 points. He was absolutely relentless, working even harder than he had for the bronze tablet. At that moment, though, several portals opened up along the roofs of the shops he was running by. Chapter 1546. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1546. Bold: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel frowned. Portals? Was that an ability of theirs? A lineage factor, maybe? Or was it something that you could buy in the shops? If it was the last of them, Lionel was in great need. If he could get his hands on one, he would need to wade through all this nonsense and could just get to the center of the city immediately. He already had enough demon points to make do regardless. At that moment, two women stepped out from the portal, each more gorgeous than the last. The first wore a pink diamond bikini armor that made one wonder why she had bothered to make it into armor at all, while the second wore elegant sky blue robes that looked like they were made for a mage. The hems of the blue robes were embroidered in a beautiful blue color, and the young woman even held a staff that curved on one end to hold a hovering crystal ball as though to complete the look. They both looked like they had leapt right out of the pages of a fantasy book and made Lionel finally decide that he had to be in a mythological zone now. No way people wore this kind of stuff unironically in broad daylight without their destination being Comic-Con. Others saw two beauties that would make their eye sockets fall out, especially with the skin the first was showing. But Lionel saw two poorly dressed beauties that almost made him sputter with laughter. So many years into the dimensional verse and he still hadn't gotten used to this stuff. Lionel finally couldn't hold it back and sputtered a bit. It threw off his timing as a demon covered in iron scales punched at him, but he still managed to sidestep it, his fit stealthily glowing with bronze runes as he punched it right in the gut. A blast of wind exited the iron-scaled demon's back and everything paused for just a moment before an enormous hole was blown through its body. Lionel treated a high-class demon with maybe the greatest defenses here as though it was nothing more than a toy plushie. The eyes of the two women narrowed. They didn't know why Lionel was suddenly laughing, and even if they were 10 times more intelligent and put their heads together to theorize, they would still never guess. A young, hot-blooded male, laughing at them for their appearance? It wouldn't even compute. Not to mention the fact that they were very used to getting compliments on their appearance and had grown up in this world unlike Lionel. However, when they saw Lionel strike down an iron-scaled demon with a single punch, their hearts couldn't help but be stirred. It seemed that they were right to come and look for this Lionel Olidark. Only by killing him now could they feel at ease. Hey, you two, those portals, how do you make them? Sure, handsome. Why don't you come up here and they'll show you? The young woman wearing the pink diamond bikini smiled sweetly, although the spear she held in her hand still glistened menacingly with a rose-bronze sheen. I have a girlfriend. But am willing to do in exchange for your information. With Aina I the same city, Lionel didn't even dare to flirt for some benefits like he had in the oligarch city. Instead, he got straight to the point. Girlfriend? How could she be more beautiful than me? The young woman bat her eyelashes. She rested the butt of her spear on the ground of the roof, leaning her head to the side and squeezing it between her bosom. With just a small push, even though the armor itself wasn't so flexible, the flesh beneath it bulged and threatened to overflow. It was such a natural action and yet it was endlessly tempting. And yet, rather than receiving the dazed response she thought she would, Lionel's gaze suddenly turned icy cold. Watch what you say. The young woman was stunned speechless, not even knowing how to respond to that. At that moment, the mage spoke out. Sillin, we don't have time for this, the final phase will start soon. Attack. The moment she spoke, she had already raised her staff into the air. Large amounts of water force began to accumulate in the surroundings, quickly forming into half a dozen javelins that sparkled beneath the sunlight. You're such a bother, Yuval. Sometimes you have to let a girl play with her food. But you're right, this stinky man is annoying. It's better if he's 6 feet deep. Lionel's cold expression only grew colder. These two women were powerful, definitely more powerful than the high class should be. It was likely that this was yet another cheating organization that wanted a leg up. Unfortunately for them, not only was he not in the mood to waste time, they had chosen the absolute worst enemy. While Lionel had suddenly been cornered, what he didn't know was that there was a commotion that had gripped the elder's circle that went beyond himself. In fact, Avraz, the Aderna family representation, hadn't been reacting much to Lionel himself because he had found something far more shocking. He stared at the name Aina Brazinger, his eyes narrowed into slits. He could tell at a glance that just by observing Aina, she was a half-breed. But who had given birth to a half-breed so bold? Not only did she dare to use the name of a great family without reservation, she even dared to appear here. Was she trying to prove herself? She was indeed quite powerful, but compared to the true geniuses of even the fiend class, she was lacking, let alone their chaos class. This poor child would get a rude awakening. Even so, Avraz couldn't help but chuckle. Everyone knew that the Aderna family was like fire and water with the Brazinger family. Maybe it was because one was blue and the other was red, but they always butt heads. To Avraz, such a scandal was top-tier entertainment. When he saw the organization that dared to bring Aina forward and allow her to carry on with such a name, he became even more amused. Very true indeed. Only that woman would dare to be so bold. Avraz showed a different expression for the second time that day and actually chuckled. Chapter 1547. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 22 p.m. Chapter 1547. Frozen. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Yuval and Sillin shot backward, a hint of blood dripping down the corner of their lips. Sillin looked at her hand, a pained expression flickering in her gaze as the last bits of ash danced into the wind, her treasure weapon no more. Yuval wore an ugly expression as she looked toward the cracked crystal ball and her mage staff. Thinking about all the resources she poured into it, she couldn't believe what was happening. From the very beginning, they were suppressed by Lionel not because they were weak, but because he was the perfect counter to them both. Sillin couldn't even manifest her spear force around Lionel and her precious spear shattered. As for Yuval, she found the control of her water force ripped away from her, stripping her of the ability to finish forming her techniques. When she tried to fight back with her staff, the crystal actually shattered under the strain. You! How can you be a spear sovereign? This doesn't make any sense. Silen's chest heaved, her hands trembling. When it finally settled in, she didn't even know what to think. A spear sovereign? That was absolutely impossible, not from someone who had to climb up from the middle class and into the higher class like this. It didn't make any sense. Lionel didn't even look at the two women. instead focusing on his hand where he overturned a bracelet that doubled as a spatial treasure. In the center of the bracelet there was a ring, and this was, of course, yet another spatial treasure. You'll never get into our, click. The sound of two spatial treasures unlocking resounded and a large number of items began to fly out one after another. The two women panicked, but it was already too late. Large numbers of bras, panties, and laced undergarments were placed on display for all to see. The very few who were still around this region and had been drawn to the sounds of battle looked on wide-eyed, their eyes practically popping out of their sockets. At that moment, the seemingly calm and level-headed Yuval shrieked at the top of her lungs. "I'll kill you." Yuval's crystal ball shattered completely, a large wave of force forming as her aura rose to another level. She looked like she had lost her mind, her fury and humiliation reaching the ultimate apex. But as far as Lionel was concerned, hadn't their goal been to kill him? This much was small compared to what they would have done if he was too weak. Lionel didn't even blink at the killing intent. Finding the item he needed, he crushed it. A portal appeared not even a moment later and he unceremoniously stepped through it, seemingly not needing anyone to teach him how to use it. He didn't even bother with Yuval and Silen's other miscellaneous items, even leaving the two spatial devices behind. He already had what he wanted and he had reconfirmed that his knowledge of spatial treasures translated well to this world as well. "Yuval, calm down." Silen, who saw that Yuval really wanted to go on a rampage, calmed her down quickly. "We have to return as quickly as possible, the final phase is about to start. Don't waste your energy on this, we were unlucky this time, he perfectly countered us. But we can still compete in killing demons." In the clouds above, a middle-aged woman sat in silence, her hands crossed upon her lap. She was the picture of refined elegance, none could pick out a single flaw in her. Unfortunately, because of this, she had never found a man worthy as well. If one couldn't be as flawless as herself, then why should she give herself to him? Wouldn't she be taking a loss? This sort of lofty pride and arrogance exuded out from her very bones. She was none other than the pavilion head of the Endless Twilight Pavilion, a woman who was a legend and maybe the only person here who didn't give Avras much face outside of a light nod. Of course, this was because her pavilion wasn't just any pavilion. It was a fiend-class pavilion. When she saw Silen and Yuval lose in such resounding fashion, she didn't seem to have much of a reaction. However, when her elegant, swan-like neck turned toward another screen to see a young woman in silent meditation, her expressionless features couldn't help but curl into a smile. "Untalented? You fools are just unable to bring out my precious little girl's full potential." Author's note, to be clear, this is not Aina's mother. When Lionel appeared, he found himself at the center of the city and nodded happily. But the first sound of discussion made him raise an eyebrow. "Didn't you hear? They're from the Endless Twilight Pavilion, there's not even a point. Even if they're the weaker members of the pavilion, there's still the Sacred Light Pavilion to worry about. It's better that we just kill demons and not participate in this. It's over our pay grade. If you're scared, just say so." "Scared? Haven't you heard the rules of that pavilion? No men. Their students aren't even allowed to have relationships. What do you think will happen to you if you approach one while their pavilion head is watching from above?" Lionel ignored the rest of the conversation, it didn't have anything to do with him. He didn't even know what the names Sacred Light and Endless Twilight even meant. Though from the context clues, it seemed that Endless Twilight was stronger than Sacred Light. Lionel entered the first building and a wide smile spread across his face the moment he did. There she was, in silent meditation, looking as gorgeous as ever. She wore an elven-style light full-body armor that covered her all the way down the length of her arms and legs. It was a bright white, alternating in plate armor and tough leathers that gave it an elegance that only accentuated everything about her. Lionel's legs carried himself forward on their own. Even though he was walking, his pace was impossibly swift. However, when others saw what he was doing, they were speechless. Was he trying to die? Before anyone could even say anything, though, Lionel had already appeared before her, a warm smile on his face as he looked down at her sitting posture. Without even opening her eyes, Aina thrust a palm out. It was so fast and swift that the beginning of the motion alone sounded like a clap of thunder. But to her surprise, her wrist was caught. Aina's eyes snapped open, ready to reach for her axe, but when her gaze focused, her eyes trembled. Whether it was the youths around, Yuval and Silan who had just managed to teleport back, or the pavilion head Ophelia who was watching from above, all of them froze at once. Without the slightest hesitation, Aina jumped up and placed her palms on either side of Lionel's face, smothering him with a kiss she didn't allow him to run away from. All time seemed to come to a grinding halt, a single tear falling out of the corner of Aina's eye. Words could not express how much she missed him. Chapter 1548. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 1548. Youth, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina seemed infatuated with the taste of Lionel's lips, forgetting about everything around her. It had only been weeks since the two last saw each other, but it felt like a lifetime. She had already sworn once that she would never leave Lionel's side, but circumstances had forcefully ripped them apart this time and there was nothing they could do about it. It wasn't until she thought about slipping her tongue into his mouth did she realize that she was going overboard and suddenly remembered that they were likely being watched by thousands of people. She pulled back somewhat shyly, but there was a strong arm around her waist she couldn't help but be shocked by. Her base physical strength when she didn't rely on blood force had always been beyond Lionel's. But just now, not only had he blocked her palm easily, but she even felt like she wouldn't be able to push her way out of his embrace unless he let her, or she used much more effort than she was willing to. It seemed that Lionel had undergone astonishing changes, maybe more than even herself. "What, are you suddenly shy now?" "I've already been sexually assaulted, someone needs to take responsibility." Aina rolled her eyes, suddenly forgetting about her embarrassment entirely. When she was speaking with Lionel, the eyes and opinions of everyone else didn't seem to matter in the slightest. "What is that? Were you suffering a loss?" "Of course not, I just think I feel like I'm getting addicted." "How about another taste?" Lionel's attempt, though, was stopped with a small palm across his lips and chin. "Another taste?" "Okay, Lionel Olidark." The emphasis of the last name made Lionel shudder, suddenly feeling a bad premonition coming along. "Why don't you tell me how it is that you've suddenly changed your last name? It can't be that you married into another family while I was absent, right? Why don't you tell me about your lovely wife?" Lionel coughed. Why was this woman so sharp? He definitely hadn't married into the Olidark family, but it was pretty close to that. Listen. An old hag forced my hand. My chastity is still well protected, safe and sound for my lovely future wife. Who wants your chastity and who's your future wife exactly? You haven't even ticked off half the things on my list. The two seemed to have forgotten entirely about the world around them. Even while it looked like they were having a couple spat, the fact Aina still had two palms on Lionel's chest, and Lionel himself hadn't let go of her waist, didn't make it seem very convincing at all. Anyone with half a brain could see that they were clearly flirting. Aina's anger and Lionel's fear didn't even manage to reach their eyes, which were filled with nothing more than love and affection. Those that didn't know Lionel and Aina could only stand in stunned jealousy of the former. Aina had only been here for maybe a day, but her feats had rocked their understanding of what it meant to be a genius while somehow also managing to be the one of the most gorgeous women they had ever laid their eyes on. Until now, she might as well have been a block of ice. But she had gone from that, to head over heels in love in the blink of an eye. It was as though she wasn't the same person at all, her golden eyes drowning in affection. Those that did know Aina, though, like Yuval and Silan, had no words. Aina was someone who had gotten personal tutelage from their pavilion head. She was someone who might have been sent to the human class sector if it wasn't both because of her low level and the pavilion head hoping to guarantee a victory across 3 sectors at once. In the time they had known her, she was polite and friendly, and they had thought her to be quite a nice and gentle person. But when they came across men, for some reason or another, she seemed to go the extra mile to draw a cold line. They had speculated that she had some trauma related to this matter in the past, but they hadn't known her well enough to ask. And yet, she had suddenly flipped a switch, not for just any man, but the very same man who had just defeated them. They didn't even know how to feel or react to such a situation. But the moment they got over this, they felt greatly worried for Aina. Aina was the first woman to fall in love from the endless Twilight Pavilion, and she definitely wouldn't be the last. But every single one of them had or would have the same outcome. The oath sworn to enter the pavilion couldn't be broken easily, and it was especially difficult when you have the eye of the pavilion head. Women who betrayed the head's trust in that fashion had the absolute worst outcomes, regardless of how great their talent had been. Their pavilion head was an elegant and refined woman, almost to an extreme. But behind her calm demeanor was a ruthless attitude, one that even many of the great families had no choice but to take seriously. In the clouds above, the expression of pavilion head Ophelia was just the same. She didn't seem to have shifted from her baseline at all, and yet somehow the air seemed several levels more frigid, so much so that several seats in the near vicinity of her shattered, sending elders well into the 7th and even 8th stars sprawling to the ground as though they were toddlers rather than experts. At that moment, though, Avras appeared by Ophelia's side and took a polite seat. "Hello, senior. This junior has had great respect for you for a very long time now. I hope to get some advice from you about." Avras could only choose this method to force Ophelia to stay put. If this woman went on a rampage now, not only would the event be ruined, but they would lose a youth who was both a spear sovereign and gained a 12-pointed star tablet. Chapter 1549. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 1549. Silver. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The clouds above had suddenly become a very quiet place. The only one speaking was Avras, who had suddenly become like a little boy trying to seek encouragement from his mother. But not a single person dared to snicker or laugh. Mistress Olidark and the others of the Olidark family didn't know how to take this situation on properly. If they tried to protect Lionel now, wouldn't that make them an enemy of a fiend power? They couldn't even handle a high-class organization. How could they possibly face off against a behemoth even the great families respected? Athri, though, as air-headed as ever, had been sobbing about the death of Sebastian and Slayton. But when she saw such a pretty woman in Lionel's arms, she seemed to forget about it all, her eyes looking forward in shock. For some reason, even though she had spent so much time saying the most disparaging things about Lionel, she felt a wave of jealousy. It was as though Lionel was her toy to throw away and pick up as she pleased, but now someone had actually dared to take it away from her without her consent. "Grandma, this isn't fair. Can you?" Mistress Olidark slapped her hand over her granddaughter's lips. It was so forceful that it might as well have been a real slap. Athri was stunned into silence. The slight stinging on her face and lips almost made her tear up again, if she wasn't so surprised that she couldn't even think of a next move to make in the first place. Mistress Olidark knew her granddaughter too well. If she said some nonsense now, even their attempts to salvage the situation might not be worth much of anything. Back in the high-class sector, Lionel and Aina were still chatting without a care in the world when the youths of the Sacred Light Pavilion came down. When Stofir saw the scene below, he didn't even know how to react. One of the many men that Aina had suddenly grown very cold toward was none other than himself. One would think that Stofir would know enough not to go after a young woman of the endless Twilight Pavilion. However, the Sacred Light Pavilion had quite a special position amongst the human class powers, and as their head disciple, Stofir was in a unique position to maximize those benefits. There was a pipeline from the Sacred Light Pavilion to the fiend class, and then the Lavis of the great families. Rules were only things meant to be followed by the weak, and as scary as Pavilion head Ophelia seemed, there was still a gap between her and the foundation of the great families. As any hot-blooded male, Stofir believed that so long as he proved his worth, the Lavis family would deal with Ophelia for him until he became powerful enough to deal with her himself. Of course, these were all naive ravings. He was comparable to some fiend-class talents, but he wasn't enough to make the likes of the Lavis family do anything for him, let alone offend such a powerhouse. But the fuel of testosterone and foolishness was strong when a beauty entered the picture. However, even though his face twisted, Lionel and Aina didn't even look in his direction. Forget about me, Lionel tried to dodge the scrutiny he was under. Didn't you just try to attack me? Why don't we talk about that? You can't even recognize your own husband? You smell diff. What's that supposed to mean? I don't remember having a husband. I smell different? Yes, you do. Lionel frowned, his head turning, suddenly feeling annoyed by a particular gaze. Those that had been watching were used to a calm and collected Lionel. He might be somewhat cold, but his actions were always restrained. However, at the moment, he was like a completely different person. Can you piss off? Stofier's face froze. He had been staring unrestrainedly, but that was because he was used to doing as he pleased, and he was more surprised by this outcome than anything else. Women of Aina's caliber were like precious gems to most families. Unlike some women who might be promised away before they were even born, talents on this level were carefully nurtured and well protected until maturity. Only then might they get married, and that was only if they weren't in an organization like the Eternal Twilight Pavilion. The odds that Aina would have a man should be practically zero, and yet now that very man was telling him to piss off without the slightest fear for his background. Forget him, come, Aina spoke, suddenly remembering something. She grabbed Lionel's hand and dragged Lionel away. Yuval and Silan only now broke out of their shocked states and tried to call after Aina, but Aina only waved and ignored them. It was as though she had completely forgotten about everything now that Lionel was here. Not long later, Lionel and Aina had made it to the top floor. Much like the middle class, a tablet hovered, but this time, Lionel saw a silver one. He thought that he might get the next portion of the dark half of his lineage factor, but he was wrong. Instead, what he saw was something that made his heart skip a beat. A union of light and darkness will reveal the 12-pointed star. The world seemed far bolder now, but Lionel's lineage factor trembled in his veins, salivating as though it hadn't eaten in weeks. This silver tablet wasn't the dark half, it was the light half. It contained the next step beyond his starry-tailed fox lineage factor. And Lionel knew exactly what was within it. The twinkling light bear lineage factor and the golden tiger lineage factor, both eighth-dimensional lineage factors that carried a weight and power that was near unfathomable. However, Lionel quickly restrained himself. Since Aina had brought him here, didn't it mean that she saw something important to her? Lionel didn't mind giving up the opportunity and helping Aina exchange for what she needed instead if it was important. What do you see? Lionel asked. Chapter 1550. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 14 seconds p.m. Chapter 1550. Perfect trust. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Oh, right, Aina, who had felt a faint excitement, controlled herself, remembering that Lionel couldn't see the same things she saw. In fact, due to the fact that two people were standing here currently, the projection to the elders above wasn't clear either. Lionel had no idea how this simple coincidence had saved him an endless pile of trouble. If the others realized that this light phase silver tablet appeared for him, the conclusion would be obvious: he already had the bronze portion. But that should be absolutely impossible. Such a thing would expose Lionel in more ways than one, and would make an already bad situation absolutely irredeemable. It's a technique golden tablet, and it's related to blood sovereignty. Lionel's brows shot up when he heard gold. He had assumed that the tablet that appeared was capped by the sector it appeared in, but this didn't seem to be the case. So long as you met the requirements, you would receive it. But, obviously, those in lower class sectors often wouldn't have the talent to earn a higher level one. Lionel assumed that if he had appeared in this sector first, the first tablet he saw would still be bronze. Lionel listened patiently as Aina explained. According to her, the tablet was filled with blood manipulation techniques, among other things. Usually, Aina's use of her blood force was quite crude. She didn't have other methods of using it outside of cutting people open, sucking it out, then using it as either blades or energy. Even the Void Palace didn't seem to have much that could help her. Blood force was simply far too rare and most couldn't use it to the level Aina could. In fact, Most of the techniques only taught methods to do what Aina already did but with much weaker efficiency. This tablet took things to a whole other level. Not to mention teaching her methods to maximize what she could already do, it even taught things like manipulating living creatures, extracting bloodlines personally, and even had methods of healing people back from the brink of death to full health in a single bound. After hearing all of these things, Lionel had only reaffirmed his decision. When he learned that it was a gold tablet, he already knew that he would fight for Aina to have it. But since it had so many tangible benefits, he was even more certain in his choice. Suddenly he looked up. It seems the final phase is about to start. Okay, let's get you this tablet. Aina smiled brightly. The reason she wanted the tablet the most was because of the healing methods within. If she could share her healing factor with Lionel, she would have far less to worry about when it came to his safety. But at that moment, she suddenly remembered that Lionel saw something differently from her. Is what you saw more important? I can give it up if... No, it isn't a big deal, definitely not worth as much as yours, anyway. Lionel pulled Aina along and they rushed out, only to find that Silan and Yuval were both waiting anxiously as everything else had already rushed out. Oh right, I have to do something real quick. Just before they could say anything, Lionel vanished. But this only made them relax further. Aina, this isn't good. Pavilion Head won't be happy. Yuval tried to advise. Aina frowned. So what? The two were stunned silent. It was a good thing the monitors had long since turned to focus on the battle royale outside, or else maybe even Avras wouldn't have been able to hold the elegant Pavilion Head back anymore. Yuval and Silan looked toward one another, realizing that it was definitely a lost cause. There wouldn't be anything they could say to change this. The only chance they had to appease Ophelia's anger was to bring the tablet back. We have to hurry, Silan pressured. We will support you and siphon all the kills to you as well. We've already received orders from Pavilion He. Aina shook her head. It's fine, me and Lionel will be enough. The two women were once again speechless. Lionel might be powerful, but he was still only one person. In addition, he had been the perfect counter to them only when they were conserving their energy for the main event. If they went all out now, they were still certain that they could win. However, Aina completely disregarded two known commodities in a pair of disciples of a fiend-class power, all for the sake of her boyfriend. Aina, listen. Lionel might be a spear sovereign, but for whatever reason, his spear force isn't as strong as one's should be. He's still lacking. Why don't you at least rely on all three of us? Silan tried to compromise. Aina's neutral impression suddenly became angry. Lacking? There is absolutely nothing lacking about him. Aina's tone made their hearts quake. They suddenly felt their blood rolling out of their control and fear gripped their throats. They didn't understand how such benign words could piss Aina off to this extent. At that moment, a gust of wind flashed and Lionel appeared. In his hand, there was a 3-meter-tall bough that wafted a dense black fog. The fog was so thick that it made it look as though the bough itself didn't have a tangible form at all. Ready? Aina's anger suddenly vanished with the wind. Ready. With that, the two shot outside. Yuval and Silan looked toward one another, helpless expressions on their faces. Their teachers had warned them that even powerful women could become stupid when in love, but they didn't think that included women as powerful as Aina too. Lionel and Aina didn't have a mind to care for the opinions of others. Though they shot outside together, they separated in the blink of an eye. Lionel's speed was so fast that he ran up the side of a building without the slightest effort. At the same time, Aina dove headlong into a swarm of demons. Even as Aina's axe appeared in her hands for the first time and she raised it high about her head, Lionel had already pulled his bowstring tight, his eyes becoming lit with a deathly focus. Then, he began to fire. His hands were like a blur, and yet his bow was absolutely steady, only shifting slightly from side to side, resulting in minor changes that catalyzed huge ones. As Aina's axe descended, the whipping wind of dozens of arrows shot by her with barely a centimeter of separation from her flesh. The timing was so perfect that when Aina's axe connected, the demons were already half dead. Lionel's control was immaculate, leaving every single kill to Aina herself. Those watching had never seen the killing of high-class demons made so easy. Even the best geniuses in this sector took 3 to 4 attacks, but Aina's axe under the lead of Lionel's bow became like a reaper's scythe, reaping the lives of dozens with a single swing. A hushed silence fell. This display spoke for itself, there was simply nothing left to say. This was something beyond perfect coordination. It was also perfect trust. Chapter 1551. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 1551. Seamless teamwork. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The coordination between Lionel and Aina couldn't have been more perfect. In fact, it was so seamless that it was almost impossible to watch. Anyone who wasn't familiar with the two of them would think that any time now, Lionel's hand would slip or his calculations would be just a small measure off and he would end up causing irreparable harm to Aina, who wasn't guarded against him in the slightest. For the likes of Yuval, Silan, and especially their pavilion head, this kind of sight was especially difficult to stomach. The idea of trusting a man so deeply was such a foreign concept to them that they short-circuited for a moment, trying to find a different explanation for what they were seeing. But no matter how many times they blinked, the images never stopped coming. As time passed and awe set in, those who had thought Lionel to be a master of the spear didn't even know what to think anymore. Spear? Wasn't this youth clearly a pinnacle expert with the bow? Why did he even waste his time picking up the spear in the first place? His anticipation, the control of bow force, his effortless calculations, it made the elders who also used a bow freeze in their seats. Were they even as good as a youth who had yet to mature? Even though they were used to fighting at speeds far beyond that of Lionel and Aina, even they wouldn't be so confident as to shoot their arrows so close to her body. It was almost as though every frame of Aina's speed movements, if frozen, would look as though had been stuck onto a canvas and had her silhouette outlined by hundreds of arrows. If she took a step forward, in the instant she widened her stances, dozens of arrows would curve between her legs and skewer the targets before her. If raised her arms, dozens more arrows would sweep underneath, barely missing her toned arms and ample chest. If she leaned her head back to dodge the blow of a demon that had overestimated itself, arrows would whiz by her slender exposed neck as though they could see glimpses of the future. All of these elders were experts. Even with Lionel firing at hundreds of arrows a minute, they could track every single one. Most of the time, these arrows would already be halfway there by the time Aina decided on her next move. Just how many battles had they fought together to reach this point? No, that wasn't even the most important question. How could one person trust another person to this level? It might not be impossible to find several people with the skill to do this, but was it even possible to find a partner who would allow you to do so? Would said partner even be able to display their full strength without feeling hesitant and suffocated, thinking that you were just one slip of the finger away from ending their life entirely? By that point, the partner would end up holding back their true strength, looking out for the moment you screwed up so that they could safely extricate themselves. But Aina didn't look like she spared a single thought toward Lionel's actions at all. It was as though she didn't even consider the possibility of him messing up. No matter how skilled you were, it was impossible for you to never make even a single mistake, right? Wasn't this girl a little bit too foolish? Wouldn't it be a shame if a genius died in this way? Ophelia gripped her armrests, ready to go down right this moment. But as the arrow count increased from hundreds, to thousands, to tens of thousands, to even hundreds of thousands, the shock only grew deeper. Lionel didn't show any signs of slowing down. In fact, he was getting faster. It was almost like he hadn't been fully used to his weapon or his bow force. The first was fine since they had all seen him by the bow just now. In fact, that only made things more shocking because he hadn't even sent out a practice shot before he started firing toward Aina, something that only made their hearts shudder all the more. But the second? How could such a skilled archer not understand their bow force fully? What they didn't know was that Lionel's bow force progressed with such speed that for most of the time he had had it had surpassed his dimension level. Just using it had placed a great strain on his mind. It could be said that while he was familiar with true Bao force, when it came to enlightened Bao force, he was nothing more than a novice. And now that he finally had its full strength at the tip of his fingers, he was relentless. Marksmanship had always given him a feeling nothing else could match, and now that he could allow it to breathe in all its glory, it was as though one shackle around his body after another was shattering to pieces. Lionel's eyes flashed, dancing between a pale violet to a bright one as though it couldn't make up its mind. Thwack! 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 The sound of the heavy thud of arrows colliding with the bodies of powerful demons echoed out every second. None seemed to cause a large amount of damage, but without fail, every time an arrow-ridden demon met Ana's blade, they would fall with a single sweep. It was as though Lionel's arrows sapped them of all their strength, forcing them into a position where they could do nothing. Ana's point total kept jumping. From around 11 million, to 12, to 13, in a blink, it felt like it doubled, crossing into the 20 million threshold. With every kill she made, a large amount of blood was surge around her, increasing her area of attack and placing more pressure on Lionel's arrows to dodge her attacks and support her. And yet, he did so as easily as breathing, as though it was never a challenge to begin with. The trio of the Sacred Light Pavilion finally seemed to notice what was happening. Chapter 1552. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1552. Stofir. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Stofir and the others had already deployed their own formation and were killing off a large number of demons. They were confident that they'd be able to outspeed anyone, so their main goal was to travel to a location in the city where they wouldn't be interfered with. They formed a huge formation of light. All they needed to do was pump their light force into it and it would burn most low-high-class demons to ash. As for the middle and high ones that entered, they would find themselves greatly weakened and they would be directly killed by Stofir. They couldn't move very fast due to the formation, but they didn't need to with so many demons swarming them in the first place. Stofir himself had already jumped from around 9 million to over 12 million in just a small while. He felt that no one else could match this pace and that their stamina was performing well, so they wouldn't have to worry about lasting until the end. Once all of this was finished, only then would he think about dealing with Lionel. There were more important things than his own ego right now. However, he would have never expected that when he looked at the point totals rather than finding that he had closed the gap and surpassed Ana, to find that he had actually been thrown so much further behind. At first Stofir thought it was a fluke. If the Endless Twilight Pavilion just happened to have a large one-time use item they used right at the beginning to expand the gap, then that was still acceptable. He was confident in his ability to catch up. But just after a few more seconds, he realized that he couldn't have been more wrong. The increase was steady, predictable, and coming in a strong, unrelenting stream. Although there were some small jumps, they happened again and again, making it clear that this was definitely not a one-time use item. Stofir realized immediately that this wasn't working. If they didn't first obstruct the Endless Twilight Pavilion and only worry about meeting the 10% mark later, they would definitely suffer. Damn it. Stofir's hair flared out, several rays of light coming out from him as he crushed the demons in the surroundings. Return, now. Stofir suddenly regretted having gone so far out to hide their methods from others. By the time they made it, Ana and the Endless Twilight Pavilion would probably have already crossed the 2 or 3% mark. The gap would only widen from there. Shit, Stofir frowned and made a tough decision. Manifest. His roar thundered, his star slowly manifesting itself. He only brought out one, but the difference was that minor runes could be seen dancing within. Stofir stomped his feet. His two juniors looked toward one another, but their trust in Stofir was deep. Without hesitation they followed suit and followed in hot pursuit. They were supposed to save their stars for the final stretch, but if this were already like this, there wasn't any time to mind anything else. They had seen the leaderboard too and they knew why their senior had acted like this. They could only go all out to make it back. There was no point in conserving their strength because if they had energy left in the end they couldn't use, then it truly wouldn't be worth it. It took several minutes for them to return, and by then, Aina was already approaching 30 million. What they saw, though, shook them. Blood whirled about Aina like a bloody rose. It was somehow both beautiful and fearsome, the rose becoming an inescapable grinder. However, while the rose alone was definitely powerful enough to make them shudder, it should have been an attack that could easily be grinded down. With his insights, Stofir could tell that while it was beautiful, it had no structure or core principle. This meant that there was no technique powering it and was rather no less complex than a simple, ordinary punch. And yet, this simple blood force attack was tearing through high-class demons as though they were nothing, and that was when they saw the arrows. Best Stofir's eyes widened. He hadn't thought of Lionel the whole way here, simply assuming that everything was related to the endless twilight. After shock, Stofir's expression darkened and his gaze sharpened. The moment Lionel fell, Aina's killing speed would plummet. His trajectory changed. With a strong step, he became like a speed bullet. Yuval and Silan hesitated. They should probably step in now. But Aina had said that they didn't need any help. While she had been protecting Lionel, it had still left them with quite some dissatisfaction. Plus, wouldn't the pavilion head kill them in a fit of rage if they stopped what could be Lionel's death? They valued their own lives far more than that, and they knew how irrational the pavilion head could be when she was enraged. Aina frowned, thinking of retreating to get closer to Lionel and intercept them. But she only received a shake of the head, and the rain of Lionel's arrows only seemed to become greater. Lionel's eyes were still focused on Aina as though he hadn't sensed Stofir's charge at all. But he knew everything he needed to. Stofir was definitely exceptionally powerful. It seemed that he was already in Tier 7 of the 6th dimension and would more than crush the usual sector-ranked disciples of the Void Palace. He definitely deserved his place as the head disciple of a human-class power. Stofir seemed to know this about himself as well as he confidently charged forward. He closed the distance, leaping when he was just 10 meters from the base of the sky rise Lionel stood upon. He shot up like a streaking star, dancing lights of white gold following his wake. Unfortunately, he actually dared to use light force in Lionel's presence. Stofir's head appeared, shooting past the ledge of the building and ready to shred Lionel to pieces. But at that moment, Lionel's hand had appeared above his star. For some reason, an overwhelming amount of fear gripped him in that instant. "Didn't I tell you to piss off?" Lionel's hand squeezed. Under the astonished gazes of those watching, the star of a human-class genius shattered like glass and his aura plummeted out of the 6th star. Chapter 1553. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 1553. Hurry, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel retracted his palm and sent a strong kick at Stofir's chest. The sound of bone cracking and shattering resounded like a crack of thunder before the air blasted apart in violent concentric circles. In one moment, foot and chest were connected, and in the next, Stofir had already crashed through an adjacent building. Lionel didn't even focus on the result. From the beginning, his priority had been Aina. He didn't seem to feel like what he had done was special at all. However, all the elders who had been paying attention to that screen rose to their feet, their eyes wide with shock and their hearts threatening to beat out of their chests. Shattering an enemy's star wasn't impossible, but it required one of two things. The first was to have overwhelming power over them. Sometimes, even an entire dimension of separation wasn't enough, especially if the target was a talent that had formed a star runes. At best, if you were much stronger, you could crack it and force the target to retract it. But, even a cracked star, while it couldn't be manifested for fear of worsening the damage, could still function normally in the body as it absorbed force to heal itself. Usually, one would have to have almost 2 dimensions of separation to do this with the ease Lionel had. However, it was very clear and obvious that Lionel was not in the 8th star. If he was, they would have definitely sensed it. Plus, the city wouldn't allow anyone about the 6th in. So that left only one explanation. The second possibility was that someone had to both have exceptionally high affinity aligned with the target star and They had to have exceptional star force affinity. There were very rarely people born with two separate affinities like this, but most often, these affinities were born into one and fused into a single state. Any force with such a high fusion of star force into it, enough to give their owner such a high affinity with star force, was called a true state star force. The odds that Lionel had a true state star force were greater than 70%. And, even if he didn't, he had already displayed such a high water force, bow force, and spear force. But now he had such high light force and the incredibly rare star force affinity. Even if it wasn't a true state star force, his individual affinities were so far beyond a human class genius that he could crush them with a single palm and a single kick. Just where did this child come from? Of course, Lionel had a true state star force, the only difference was that he called it a true state force. Top 10 in star forces. Top 3 in light forces. Top 1 in fire forces. Not only did he have it, but if he displayed the number of star runes he had also formed for it, he could raise this entire to the ground. After truly comprehending dimensional cleanse, Lionel found that his mage core's ability to control atmospheric force, especially ones he had affinity for, had increased hundreds of folds. If he wanted, he could have simply sapped Stofir of all his light force just not and rendered his attack useless. But he didn't like the look of the latter's face. With Stofir down, especially the way he had gone down, his two juniors didn't dare to step forward and could only rush to save their senior. No matter what, they refused to join in losing their stars. If their star was shattered, it would take months to even years to reform. Then they would have to redo the sixth dimension all over again. It was safe to say that at least for now, Stofir's time as a genius was finished. With no other obstacles, Lionel and Aina tore through the city of demons without the slightest rest. Not even half an hour later, it clicked and they crossed the 10% mark. Aina returned to Lionel's side with a sweet smile. She wasn't very surprised by the result, but it filled her with satisfaction knowing that others had been proven wrong about her man. There was something different about your bow force. Aina stayed still and let Lionel dab away the slight sheen of sweat on her face, her smile only growing brighter. It does feel different. I feel like I could make it enter the seventh dimension whenever I want. But after experiencing that once, I don't really want to do it again. Oh, Aina nodded as though this was only a matter of course. The duo were speaking in a language no one could understand. If it wasn't for this, who knew how others would react? Okay, Lionel stepped back after he was satisfied. Quickly go trade for it. We still have to go to human class. It will be dangerous if there are many as powerful as the annoying guy. Aina nodded and flashed toward the top of the sky rise. As for Lionel, he used some of his points to exchange for quite a few items. But ultimately, he was still missing 3 things he needed. The good news was these were quite high-class items, so it was likely that the high-class sector simply wouldn't have them but others' world. Just buying what he needed, Lionel had gone from over 3 million demon points to just over 1 million, the rest entering his spent category. The observers had no idea what he was doing, but they simply concluded that he wanted these items for his own personal use. But a lot of them seemed to be spatial items. Did Lionel also have a spatial affinity? They shuddered at the thought. Aina came back out quickly, her aura having already changed considerably. It seemed that golden tablets were actually special and fused with you, allowing her to learn many of its lower-level techniques without even trying. Lionel nodded. When we have time, I have another technique I want you to learn. I didn't think it was important before but I'll explain later. We should hurry. Aina didn't even have a thought to spare for Yuval and Silan as she and Lionel charged into the human class sector. Chapter 1554. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 7 seconds p.m. Chapter 1554. Human class sector. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Do you really have a way out? Aina asked. Of course, aren't I amazing? Lionel grinned. The two shot through the portal, appearing in an all-new city sector that was clearly even larger than the high-class sect. But what was special about this location was the fact that there didn't seem to be any demons present to attack them automatically. In fact, even after a quick sweep with his senses, Lionel found that he couldn't find any in a kilometer range either, at least not with a surface-level sweep. Lionel's gaze narrowed at this prospect. This was the human class, and it was considered a huge dividing line between the low, middle and high classes. Demons of this caliber were truly dangerous. If Stofier's strength was anything to go by, this sector would definitely not be easy to manage. The level of power Stofier had was the equivalent of top-level sector-ranked disciples of the Void Palace, yet his elders had still sent him down to the high-class sector. This meant one thing for sure, that they only felt that Stofier could guarantee them a victory there. That meant that, without a doubt, there were people equally as if not more powerful than that here, and not all of them would have affinities that Lionel could easily just crush, so they had to be exceptionally cautious. It was very likely that many of these people would have power, maybe rivaling or even surpassing that of his mother, and to Lionel, he still couldn't see the peak his mother stood at. The higher up in dimensions you went, the larger the dividing lines between individual tiers was. It would be difficult. Very difficult. The other sectors had been almost too easy, but this time Lionel would have to prepare a bit. His greatest evolution wasn't in the strength of his body, but rather the strength of his mind. Even if he couldn't leave this place with a gold tablet of his own, he had no intention of leaving behind the silver tablet. He had to have at least that. Are you sure? Aina raised an eyebrow. Are you doubting me? Lionel's serious expression vanished into a teasing one. I'm hurt. Aina rolled her eyes. Was there even anyone in the world who trusted him more at this point? When it came to matters of strength, Aina didn't even think twice. She didn't even blink when he said he could promote his bow force whenever he wanted. But right now, they were stuck in a zone. When she had met Lionel again, she had shed a tear because seeing him at least meant that if they were going to die here, they could do so together. She realized then that even if she could never get revenge for her mother, she would be able to calm her heart so long as Lionel was by her side. Ultimately, she had already resigned to a life of being stuck in this place. Though it was quite harsh and demons were a constant, looming threat, it wasn't much different from their own world, the threats were just different. Plus, this place didn't seem to have invalids obsessed with stealing her away to force her to birth their children. So, in her books, this was an enormous plus. She couldn't even put into words just how revolting and sick just the thought of it was to her. But now Lionel was saying that he could bring them out. It had to be known that in the history of the dimensional verse, no one had ever succeeded in such a thing. Powerful experts had been lost inside, never to return. Even the children of powerful experts had been stuck, but even their parents couldn't get them out. It was impossible. Completely impossible. You aren't lying to me to make me feel better, right? Aina didn't look angry at the prospect. In fact, her eyes looked quite vulnerable right this moment. Regardless of the answer, she wouldn't get angry. Lionel probably knew how important revenge was to her. Even if she could force her heart to settle down and forget, that didn't mean that she would be truly at ease if she couldn't make the Brazinger family pay. But she wanted him to know that it was all right. He didn't have to go so far and push himself so much if it was truly impossible. Lionel's smile faded and his expression turned serious. His hand reached forward and he smoothed out a piece of loose hair, his actions impossibly gentle for a man who had just crippled another with that very same palm just moments ago. I can do the impossible. They were simple words and wildly boastful, but Aina still felt her heart bloom. For some reason, she was certain that he wasn't lying. Okay, Aina grabbed onto Lionel's arm with a happy smile. If you really succeed, I can clear my baby-making time slots for you. Lionel's serious and cool demeanor shattered as he choked on air. Clear? Time slots? What's that supposed to mean? Aina looked away as though he hadn't heard him at all. Look, a demon. Lionel's head snapped in the direction Aina had pointed in, but there was nothing there. Realizing he had been duped, his head snapped back only to realize that Aina had vanished into a puff of crimson, her speed impossibly fast. Lionel was speechless. How had he fallen for the oldest trick in the book? Especially when his senses were the strongest ability he had? After recovering, Lionel laughed, a whirl of light force appearing around him as he shot forward. Compared to the speed he had displayed before, this was easily dozens of times faster. A streak of crimson and one of gold tore a path through the city, towing a line between two accumulating armies. The human class sector was, indeed, a lot different. The demons knew how to use their brains, how to strategize and bide their time. This was why, the moment Lionel and Aina appeared, they immediately became number 1 and 2 on the leaderboards. Once the battle truly began, it would be a bloodbath. Chapter 1555. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 1555. Show off if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel and Aina made it all the way to the center of the city without the slightest obstruction. Lionel had been lamenting the fact that they wouldn't have a teleportation method here, but surprisingly, although it was slower, it wasn't a terrible experience either. With their speed, it took maybe an hour to reach the center of the city, but not much more than that. When they got there, though, there was, once again, nothing to see. By this point, Lionel had noticed the leaderboard and he realized even those with the highest point totals only have demon points totaling in the tens of thousands. According to what he knew, these totals were what one could expect for killing 1 or 2 human-class demons. This meant that even the strongest here only had so few kills. No, it was more accurate to say that the luckiest here had so few, because Lionel highly doubted that such a list was representative of the strongest here. However, that left Lionel and Aina with a huge advantage. Aina alone had over 100 million points. And Lionel, though his points were already used, had over 3 million. Lionel's points weren't very important, but Aina should be able to exchange for what they needed. Like the proud gigolo he was, Lionel let Aina pay for everything and they became the first to step into the central sky rises and the only ones with access to their shops. Very quickly, they began looking for what Lionel needed. This is a necessity, with this there should only be one thing left. Lionel held the force quill in his hand, but it felt impossibly heavy in his hand, almost like it was a spear or a greatsword instead of the quill it was meant to be. The tip was carved out of a bronze metal that almost made it look like the embroidered helmet of a sentinel. This tip led to a dense black that seemed smooth upon first look, but needled into Lionel's metallic skin as though it was wet tissue paper. The moment Lionel touched it, his blood dripped down and pooled at the bronze tip, ready to drip at any moment. At the same time, the pure white feather that connected to the black stem began to glow a fierce rouge light. Clang! Just like that, the rouge light snapped close like the pieces of an armor and shield, dancing with complex runes. Without much of a thought, Lionel drew a pen stroke across the air, causing the rouge light to tremble and cause a surge of force to multiply and fuse with Lionel's own. This was exactly the effect Lionel needed. This force quill was a quasi-life grade force quill, a treasure on the same level as the white lion bow. What Lionel needed to do couldn't be done with just his power alone. He needed to borrow power from the world around him. The good news was that mastering, dimensional cleanse, had actually made this force quill almost unnecessary. The even better news was that the combination of the two made his odds of success all the greater. There was no doubt that this force quill would be with him for a long while. If not for this zone, who knew how long it would take him to get his hands on one of this caliber? This force quill is a bit sinister. It's skimming at your life force to work. Lionel nodded. It's also a bit unruly. It's taking more than it needs, probably because it's near the life grade so it thinks it's too good for me. If it broke into the life grade right now, I probably wouldn't even be able to pick it up. Lionel chuckled. A force quill not acknowledging him? He would like to see how long it would remain stubborn for. In no time at all, it would be obediently taking only as much life force as it needed. As for right now, Lionel wasn't even worried about it. With vital star force fueling his body, life force wasn't something he needed to worry about. Vital star force could be considered to be to life force what soul force was to dream force. Of course, life force was of a higher grade than vital star force. This was because life force encompassed everything while vital star force was only designed for the body. However, when it came to purely body-related things like a body's strength and longevity, vital star force didn't lose out to life force in any way. This was why Lionel's raw physical strength had finally caught up to Aina's. So you said there's one more thing we need? Yes, one more thing. I need a material strong enough to withstand the procedure. It needs to be both very sturdy and have a spatial affinity. The trouble is that materials like that are simply too rare. Ores with high spatial force tend to be more volatile and unstable. I need one that's the exact opposite. It doesn't seem like the human class sector has something strong enough. Then we'll need to go to the fiend class. Lionel nodded slowly. He didn't say it, but he felt that without an opportunity to first complete the final leg of his plan, and with Aina not having time to meditate on her gold tablet, the human class was their limit. And, even then, they were greatly stretching themselves. If they wanted to exchange for something in the fiend class sector, they would definitely need to earn all the points they could here. After just purchasing 2 things here, Aina's more than 100 million demon points had almost been completely wiped out. She barely had 10 million left. It wouldn't be enough to buy the material even if Lionel had found it here. This told Lionel that if they didn't go into the fiend class with enough points, they would never be able to gather enough there. Getting 10% of the kills in this sector would be hard enough, but now they couldn't stop there. Lionel felt they would need to kill at least 20% to ensure that they would have enough to trade for what would likely be a life-grade Oregon. Lionel took a breath and closed his eyes. We can't do this like we did in the high class. Lionel spun his new force quill through his fingers, his dexterity seemingly having increased to an impossible level. So it seems I'm going to have to show off a bit. Blueprints danced through Lionel's mind. He didn't realize that the commotion he was about to cause would lead to a cascade of events he would have no power to stop. Chapter 1556. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1556. Subtle. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel walked up to the side of a building and began inspecting it. Aina didn't say anything as she followed along, simply allowing Lionel to focus. But as unexpressive as Lionel's face was, his mind was like a raging storm. Due to what had happened at the Void Tower, Lionel's dream world looked a lot more like a universe of its own, his synapses becoming like the usually imaginary lines that connected the stars of a constellation. Planets moved, asteroids rushed about, and stars sparkled and faded. It was as though Lionel's thoughts themselves could force world-shattering changes, the changes the likes of which could cause upheaval on a cataclysmic scale. As expected, practically everything here is made up of seventh-dimensional materials at worst. That's both a good and a bad thing, Lionel's thoughts danced about in his mind. The Dwarven race's force arts, the Morales family's force arts, the Luxnix family's force arts, and even snippets of the spiritual race's force arts all danced about in Lionel's mind, a raging tempest of thoughts forming up and then collapsing one after another. It's possible. It's possible if I copy. Maybe with a few changes here and there. Lionel's mind was on a completely different level than it had been before, but when it came to the force arts of the Dwarven race, copying with just a few liberties was still the best that he could do. However, he felt that he was getting closer and closer on that front. All he was lacking was time. But time was maybe what he lacked the most. He had given himself 2 more weeks to gain enough strength to leave the Olidark family, but now it felt like that timeline was trying to swallow him whole. Best despite the pressure, Lionel only seemed to grow calmer, his mind working faster and faster. At that moment, Lionel's palm flipped over the force quill appeared, his pale violet eyes glowing with a blinding light as he began to draw across the side of a building. He seemed to forget about everything else, trusting Aina entirely to protect his back. The appearance of Lionel and Aina had definitely caught the attention of the human class geniuses who were still biding their time and waiting for the events to begin. But the ones caught the most off guard were the trio who recognized Aina's name. Could it be that Aina had already claimed the top prize of the high class? That much was great, but where were Yuval and Silan, then? And also, why hadn't there been any attempt to contact them? There were more than a few options on how to do so, even if you were scared about the retaliation of the human class demons. The trio of young women looked toward one another. They realized that something here wasn't quite right, especially since there was also this Leonidas character. But the benefit of an extra helper wouldn't be small, so they had to try and find Aina. In the skies above, Ophelia continued to watch on with a cold gaze. When she saw Aina waste 100 million demon points on Lionel, buying up everything he pointed out without the slightest hesitation, her smoldering fury only became deeper and deeper. She seemed to have completely forgotten that it was only because of Lionel that Aina had accumulated so many points so easily to begin with. She couldn't seem to wrap her head around the idea of mutual aid, trust, and respect. Her gaze focused on Aina, never leaving her once. She didn't even seem to notice what it was that Lionel was doing at all. Or maybe it was just that she didn't care. Avraz, though, was watching on in confusion. That was clearly a force quill, but why wasn't it a force art language that he didn't recognize? Not recognizing it was still fine, but he should still be able to deduce its effects much like Lionel could with the dwarven race's force arts. However, he actually couldn't make heads or tails of it. It felt impossible that Lionel's attainments in force arts could be deeper than his own. Could it be that he was just trying to show off for a girl and doing whatever nonsense came to mind? But that didn't seem to make much sense either. Lionel clearly had enough skill that such tricks weren't necessary. Plus, he already had the heart of the bastard child of the Brazingers, so was doing such a thing even worth it? Odd. Lionel didn't have time to pay attention to the thoughts of others. As he moved, he only seemed to become faster. It had been so long since he had crafted anything that he forgot how much he loved it. To Lionel's shock, though, as he continued to draw, a subtle sort of feeling began to dance on the edge of his quill's tip. In fact, the unruly quasi-life grade force quill only seemed to become more and more obedient with each passing second. For a moment, the quill felt no different from a spear or his bow. His control over it was immaculate, and the artistic conception that flooded forth from its body enveloped Lionel, causing him to sink even deeper into his thoughts. He had felt this feeling once before. When he forged the final creation of his last force quill, a force quill that had followed by his side for years, he could almost feel its mourning, its excitement, its final will. That feeling was oh so subtle before, but after grasping the first stage of his grandfather's spear technique, it became sharper. Rather than a slight melody pulling at his will, it felt as though the dong of a sonorous bell was ringing in his mind. Lionel seemed to vanish, fusing into the world itself. It suddenly wasn't clear where his hand stopped and where his quill began. And then it clicked. He realized what was lacking from his bow force and from his spear force. Chapter 1557. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:33 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1557. Cat fight. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel moved faster and faster, gorgeous semi- and quarter-circular arcs beginning to layer atop of one another to become more and more complex. Even before it became functional, it was beautiful. And even before it was beautiful, it was perfect. Every line, every edge and every overlap was precise to the millimeter, not a single piece out of place. Lionel shattered a window and began to weave in and out of the building, his force art swallowing more and more of it all without a care for what function it had produced before. Aina. At that moment, Aina had been entirely focused on Lionel, her own eyes in somewhat of a trance. But she still knew that her role was to protect Lionel as best she could during this period. So, she had already noticed when others were approaching, and she frowned when she heard them call her name. Aina turned to find 3 familiar faces, all of whom were from the Endless Twilight Pavilion. Compared to the other powers, the Endless Twilight Pavilion had been the most brazen. Some others might only participate in 2 separate sectors if they had the means to do so secretly. The Endless Twilight Pavilion, though, sent in 9 disciples to cover 3 different sectors: the high-class sector, the human class sector and the fiend class sector. In fact, if it wasn't because she disdained to do so, Ophelia would have sent people into the middle and low classes as well, all so that she could maximize her chances at laying claim to as many tablets as possible. The three women had auras far more dense and powerful than that of Yuval and Silan. As three of the top 6 disciples of a fiend-class power, this was all to be expected. As for ranked 4th through 6th of a fiend-class power, they should be able to easily bury the likes of Stofir. Aina felt quite a bit of pressure facing them. There was nothing much she could do about that. These three were already very close to entering the 7th dimension. If they didn't make her feel so much pressure, their decades of practice would have all gone to waste. Yes? Aina's reply left the three not quite knowing what to say. The one who had initially spoken was the 4th ranked and the leader amongst the three. She had a fiery head of red hair and bright violet eyes. However, the aura she gave off was quite electric, the air sparking around her before fading back to normal. If her lightning force was compared to the trio of the Lightning Lance Pavilion, it could only be said to be akin to night and day. The gap was far too large, so much so that lightning force itself seemed to react to the fluctuations in her emotions. Did Pavilion Head not make herself clear? In the case that any one of us finishes early and promotes to the next sector, we're to gather together as quickly as possible. I would be able to make concessions for you if you were delayed, but it doesn't look like you were delayed at all. What do you think you're doing? Aina's eyes narrowed. I have something to do, I won't be joining you. Excuse me? Sparks flew around Lovira, dancing between golden, red and violet. The sizzling of the air seemed to raise the temperature, an oppressive might descending. I said that I won't be joining you. Aina's voice grew colder. Good luck. Are you betraying the endless Twilight Pavilion? Are you breaking the trust of the sisterhood? The one who spoke was the 5th-ranked Marcy. While her temper was much gentler in comparison to Lovira's hot-bloodedness, she didn't seem very happy with what was happening either. They were Aina's seniors, just by virtue of that alone, they deserved her respect. This was how the world worked. To actually dare to try and blow them off, and for what, exactly? Their gazes shifted from Aina to a shadow that continuously appeared and vanished in the windows of the adjacent shop. They had no idea what he was doing, but when they laid eyes on the elaborate pattern surrounding the building, their hearts couldn't help but tremble for some reason. Betraying? I was taken into the endless Twilight Pavilion to be a maidservant. If it wasn't for my own personal talent, I would have already been flogged to death. Even after I survived that ordeal, I was forced to choose between dying and becoming a student of your pavilion. What sisterhood, exactly? The coercion in Aina's voice only seemed to increase with every word she spoke. She was already tall for a woman to begin with, standing after over 6 feet. Her hair might not be the same crimson of the Brazingers, but her aura was no less potent if not more so. Facing the likes of Lovira, if it was in terms of raw power, she might lose, but if it was a battle of momentum and aura, she would lose to no one. Lovira felt her heart quake. Looking into Aina's bright golden eyes, it felt as though she was staring into the soul of a war goddess. Your sisterhood is worth nothing to me, and certainly not as much as a single hair on his head. I advise that you leave us alone and preserve your strength for the coming final phase. If not, I'll make certain that you suffer here even if I lose. Lovira's gaze flickered. If anyone else so weak had said such nonsense to her, she might spit in their face long before she took it seriously. But a blood sovereign. A blood sovereign was too unpredictable. It was precisely this blood sovereign ability that caught the eye of the forever unimpressed Ophelia. At that moment, the sound of clapping echoed. Oh ho ho, front row seats to a cat fight, lucky us. Do you think we'll get any nipple action this time? A teasing voice came from the top of a sky rise. A foot appeared on the ledge before a handsome face peered over to catch a glimpse of what was happening below. Chapter 1558. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:33 p.m. Chapter 1558. Pathetic. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lovira's expression darkened as she looked up. She had hoped that this could be dealt with without involving others, but it was quite clear that their movements would be monitored by anyone with a vested interest in winning. And, just as obviously, anyone who dared to so blatantly provoke them like this was yet another power that wouldn't lose out to the endless Twilight Pavilion by much at all. The Star Force Pavilion. The Star Force Pavilion was famous for only accepting disciples with rare star affinities. It could be said that outside powers that could be considered subsidiaries of the great families like the Sacred Light Pavilion Stofir had been a part of, the Endless Twilight Pavilion, the Star Force Pavilion, and the Eternal Dream Pavilion were the very strongest. All three were fiend-class powers only below that of the great families, but truthfully, it was a bit inaccurate to see them like this. There was only one Chaos-class bubble in the human world which was protected jointly by the four great families. This bubble often received the support of these powerful fiend-class powers as well, and often the greatest geniuses of these fiend-class powers would play a large role in defending said bubble. It could be said that the only reason these highest-level fiend-class powers weren't considered Chaos-class powers was that there wasn't enough opportunity to grow. At least that was what it seemed like on the surface. In reality, things were even more complicated than just this alone. Regardless, the Eternal Dream Pavilion was one that was quite mysterious and didn't often take part in such affairs. They were the only power not to send a single individual here. That mostly left the Endless Twilight Pavilion and the Star Force Pavilion to butt heads and figure out how to divide these spoils alone, something that quite frankly left everyone else stuck. The one who had spoken just now was the fourth-ranked disciple of the Star Force Pavilion, TYBTH. He was the equivalent of Lovira in almost every way, so it wasn't a surprise that he didn't care about offending her with his words. Lovira, don't be like that, is there a need to glare? I've already told you that if you keep this up, you'll end up with more wrinkles than you know what to do with soon enough. How about I give you a massage and help you to smoothen them out? I can help you smooth out a lot of things. TYBTH grinned wildly, his eyes scanning Lovira up and down. Despite the fact he was standing on top of a building at least a few hundred meters tall, to him, she might as well have been right in front of him. Lovira's jaw set, the lightning around her continuing to dance and spark. They almost looked like fine cracks in space, ready to implode at any moment. Suddenly, and completely without warning, Lovira's arm shot forward, her hand forming into a crackling blade that pierced right for Aina's heart. Best Aina, however, didn't seem very surprised by this result at all. The more powerful her life force grew, the more sensitive she became to such things. Bang! The polearm of Aina's battle axe appeared between herself and Lovira, its blade slamming heavily into the ground. The timing was perfect and Lovira's middle finger slammed heavily into the axe. A crackle of lightning surged forward, but Aina had already retreated, her expression cold. Lovira's beautiful countenance twisted, seemingly not expecting her surprise attack to fail, but she had already followed up with another strike, her palms raining down like a torrential rain. Aina's eyes narrowed, her body seemingly moving on its own. None of her strikes were telegraphed and she moved as freely as a leaf in the wind. The gentleness she had learned from wielding a silk cloth as her main weapon for so long seemed to have long since been ingrained into her very being. Slap! Lovira's face swiveled to the side, hard. It looked for a moment as though her head might twist off her neck just from the force of the blow alone, one of her teeth even flying out from her mouth as her cheek quickly swelled only to just as quickly begin to heal. Aina took aback, grabbing her axe. Your close combat skills are pathetic. If you want to teach me a lesson, I advise you to fight for real, or else I really won't mind killing you right here and now. Aina's voice didn't seem to carry even the slightest emotion, but the bloodthirstiness wasn't to be underestimated. She had never been like Lionel. She never hesitated to kill and she would never blink an eye toward slaughter. Lionel only seemed capable of flipping on that switch when those he cared about were harmed, but she didn't even need this much. So long as someone stood in her way, she would rip out their intestines and strangle them with it if it was the only way to win. And all the while, she wouldn't blink a single time. TYBTH clapped and laughed from above. He even took a seat, his two juniors laughing and sitting by his side. It seemed that they were having the time of their lives. You slapped me? Lovira touched the cut on her lip that was already almost entirely closed, her expression as dark and murky as a swamp's waters. Aina didn't respond. In truth, she would have preferred a solid punch to deal some real damage, but the gap in Lovira's defenses was too small and narrow. Since she didn't expect to win this battle in one blow anyway, she chose to humiliate and enrage her enemy instead. When it came to close combat instincts, Aina didn't feel like there was anyone in this world that was her match. Her grip on her AXS polearm tightened somewhat and she raised it into the air, pointing it straight at Lovira. Come. Chapter 1559. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:32 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 1559. Shattered window. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lovira's met Aina's gaze, a smoldering fury within their depths. You too, don't you dare interfere. If you do, I'll kill you personally. Marcy and Farah looked toward each other somewhat helplessly. On the one hand, they knew that they needed to deal with Aina. Not only were her actions a humiliation to their pavilion, but she could also jeopardize their mission once the final phase truly began. However, on the other hand, it was too difficult to deal with blood sovereigns. Their healing factors were out of this world, their ability to scale their abilities beyond their limits was greater than in any other path, and when you paired that with a stubborn attitude like Aina, the results could be disastrous. Up above, the members of the Star Force Pavilion were already chuckling and laughing at them, but Lovira had already stepped beyond the threshold of no return. Her temper was too fiery. And it definitely didn't help that she wielded not one, but two top 10 lightning forces. Violet Bolt Force, known for its piercing power, and Crimson Implosion Force, known for its explosive power. When the two were put together, Lovira shot forward, her speed fast and her palms already rising into the air to reveal a great sword with a blade that was 2 meters tall and 2 feet wide. It swirled with a violent tempest of red and violet lightning and it descended like a howling wind. Aina's gaze flashed, her axe arching backward and then swinging upward. A moment before the collision, her wrist shifted ever so slightly, causing her AXS blade to nick the side of Lovira's greatsword and knocking it to the side. Bang! Lovira's greatsword glanced by Aina's shoulder, its spark of lightning tearing into the latter's white leather and plate armor almost down to her shoulder's tender flesh. Then with a harsh sound, it collided into the ground, as Aina's axe force blazed to life. Enlightened axe force trembled, wavering between a golden and a white color before settling on the latter. By all rights, Aina had the advantage. With a single glancing blow, she closed the distance between herself and Lovira, the latter's greatsword still stuck in the ground as Aina transferred the upward momentum of her battle axe one again into a downward momentum. Her ability to shift and use strength that she had already accumulated was immaculate. Every movement was seamless and not even a hint of energy was wasted. There was simply no one who understood her body better than herself. However, the gap between her and Lovira was too large. While it was clear to anyone that Aina's skill was greater, Lovira could close the gap with sheer raw power. Lovira took a heavy step back, forcefully changing the momentum of her greatsword and pulling it out from the ground to block Aina's blow. Aina's wrists trembled, her axe threatening to fly from her hands, but she had already prepared to use this new momentum to swing down again. Unfortunately, Lovira, after making Aina go numb once, forced her to do it again, and then again. Clang! 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 Collision after collision resounded and Lovira pushed Aina back a step with everyone. At first it was even, but Aina's losses became more and more pronounced with every exchange. And to make matters worse, the sparks of purple and red lightning were having residual area of effect impact. Aina's white armor became charged in several places, and if it wasn't for it, the results would have been far more difficult to handle. Lovira's attacks became faster and faster as Aina's counters had no choice but to become less skilled. The stronger Lovira's attacks, the more difficult it was for Aina to prepare an adequate rebuttal, and the more pressure she had to face. Lovira's expression only became more savage. As enraged as she hadn't lost her mind yet. This was as much power as she was willing to use because this wouldn't impact her battle prowess later on. But it still infuriated her that Aina could last for so long. She sneered when she saw that the web of Aina fingers were accumulating more and more blood. So what if they continuously healed? She would still make this junior who didn't know her place suffer. Bang! Aina skidded backward, her expression still placid. Lovira held out her great sword, the tempest of lightning around it growing by another measure. With a heavy stomp forward, the ground quaked and a surging tide of red lightning split the ground. Ha! Lovira released a low shout, her greatsword waving forward and causing a scythe of lightning force to shoot for Aina. Aina's eyes narrowed. Rather than retreating, she took a heavy step forward as well, her axe swinging down with all her might as a crimson aura condensed around her. Ha! Aina's out shout came out like a sonorous bell, an odd resonant feeling gripping the hearts of those who heard it. At the instant before the two attacks met, the crimson aura around Aina seemed to respond to the shout, multiplying in force by tenfold just the instant before they met. Bang! Aina stumbled backward, her axe almost flying out from her hand, but her grip remained true. The ground cracked with each one of her heavy steps until she finally managed to stop on the third, a small exhale coming out from her pink lips. Lovira's eyes widened. She survived that without being heavily injured? How was that even possible? It didn't make any sense. That attack was already enough for even the likes of TYBTH to take seriously, let alone a small-time disciple like Aina. Just when Lovira was about to break her own rules and use more strength, she suddenly felt as though her soul had been plunged into the depths of hell. Her head snapped up, only to find a boy years her junior looking down at her from the ledge of a shattered window. Chapter 1560. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:32 and 56 seconds p.m. Chapter 1560. Why don't you? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel hopped down from the ledge, landing on the ground as though he was nothing more than a feather. It was especially odd since he hadn't seemed to have done anything to slow his descent. In fact, it looked as though he had even sped up his fall. Lionel frowned when he saw Aina's bloody hands. He could tell that the skin beneath was already healed, but it didn't make him happy at all. He sighed. Didn't I tell you that you should always carry around a bunch of blood? It's too useful to your combat abilities not to. Aina only smiled but didn't respond. She didn't carry around blood with her mostly because it felt like a cheat. Her blood force enhanced her abilities, but they weren't her foundational abilities, at least that was the way she saw it. In her mind, her main focus should be increasing her raw ability. Then, of course, her blood force would be able to boost that when she needed it, thus making her stronger. All this time, Aina's blood force had been like an enigmatic existence looming at the back of her mind. She never really understood it or what it meant to be a blood sovereign. In fact, she somewhat hated it and wanted to run from it due to the bad experiences it had caused her. The fusion with the gold tablet seemed to have subtly changed those thoughts within her, but she had only combined with it a few hours ago at most. How would that be enough time to change her entire mentality? Ultimately, she knew that Lionel was right and had always been right. If she had stored the large amount of demon blood she had gotten from the high-class sector instead of just leaving it behind like she usually did, then she wouldn't have suffered as much or maybe even not at all. When she faced increasingly powerful opponents, she couldn't always hope to snatch their blood from them. Just then when she had slapped Lovira and managed to draw blood, she realized that she couldn't even snatch away the latter's blood force, leading to her being pushed to the edge and forced to use a technique she wasn't even sure would work. Luckily it had, but she still felt that it was a close call. If not for this, she would have been heavily injured if not dead. Are you the one who tricked my junior into doing your dirty work? Lovira seemed to have finally recovered, but she found herself frozen again when Lionel looked at her. Once was already enough, but for it to happen twice now, she realized that this wasn't a coincidence. Something about this man was even more dangerous than her, and that wasn't a feeling that she was used to being born with her two lightning force affinities. Who is that? Lionel asked, ignoring her question. A disciple of the Endless Twilight Pavilion? Endless Twilight Pavilion? What does she mean I tricked you? It's a female-only organization, Aina explained simply. Oh. No wonder it's called Endless Twilight. It's probably run by an old lady who thinks her prime extends to infinity. It makes sense she's raised such bitter disciples. Aina opened her mouth to respond, but when what Lionel said hit her, she was frozen in silence for a moment before she snorted beside herself, her laughter echoing throughout the silent city. However, Aina was the only one who was laughing. Whether it was the three women, or Tybth and the other men above, none of them dared to. In fact, even if they found it amusing in their hearts, they wouldn't dare to. Lionel had just said those words out loud for everyone to hear, and there was an almost 100% certainty that the fiery-tempered pavilion head Ophelia had heard them. Old lady? Past her prime? Bitter? You dare say such words about pavilion head Ophelia? Lionel's head turned back. Since you dared to injure her, why don't you just die? Lovira, who hadn't expected such a change, suddenly felt an overwhelming danger take hold of her. Boom. 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 At that moment, the building that Lionel had just been in shrunk by 3 factors. No, it hadn't shrunk. Rather, it had condensed, becoming a mass of 7th-dimensional material that snaked into the skies and quickly formed the head of a horned dragon. Roar. The devastating sound broke the sound barrier, shattering the windows of countless sky rises as a huge accumulation of fire force began to accumulate in the horned dragon's mouth. Run. This was the only thought in Lovira's mind as she sprinted away, her eyes signaling the very same thing to her companions. Damn it. Lovira instantly realized that there wasn't enough time. The other 2 disciples would have time, but she most definitely would not. The heat already began to scorch her skin, a raging tempering swirling about the mouth of the construct before it even breathed out. And when it finally did, it was as though the world was dyed in red. Lovira unleashed her stars all at once. Under the shocked eyes of the spectators, she was actually able to manifest 4, but the despair on her face spoke volumes. A pillar of fire descended from above, enveloping her completely. The concrete melted to liquid, the foundation of several buildings to the side warping and collapsing. The fire slowly waned, but the heat only seemed to continue to rise. The only 2 who seemed completely unaffected were Lionel and Aina, the former because no flame could possibly hurt him, and the latter because she had his protection. She survived. Lionel mumbled to himself, watching as a half-charred and completely naked Lovira coughed and stumbled, the molten pavement sticking to her and causing her to scream out in horror and pain. Unfortunately for her, though, there was no beauty to see in her naked form. There was nothing but a half-bald head, boiling skin, and charred flesh. Lionel prompted the horned dragon construct to raise its head again to attack, but at that moment the ground rumbled. He looked off into the distance, his eyes narrowing. It seemed that the human-class demons were finally launching their assault. Chapter 1561. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:32 and 54 seconds p.m. Chapter 1561. Sheep. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ophelia rose to her feet violently. Although her expression still didn't have a single change, the same couldn't be said for the aura around her. In fact, it seemed as though the entire cloud construct they stood upon might collapse at any moment. Avraz was caught between shock, awe, and helplessness. This boy's mouth was truly something, but who could have possibly guessed that Lionel's greatest talent wouldn't be his spear, his bow, or even his true state star force, but rather his force crafting. None of them could understand how such a talent had appeared out of nowhere. It simply didn't make sense for him to not at least be part of a human class power. Where the hell had he come from? Ophelia turned to leave, her steps slow and deliberate. Avra's expression changed and he quickly vanished to block Ophelia's path. With his stature, he was naturally far taller and larger than the delicately framed pavilion head, however none of that seemed to matter at all as he continued to try to be as respectful as possible. Best, pavilion head, please show some patience. I really cannot allow you to interfere. The child has a foul mouth that spews nothing but lies. How could the gorgeous Ophelia's prime not be endless? However, while he has a foul mouth, he hasn't broken any rules. How can the great families continue to hold our heads high if we cannot protect the youths who are deserving of it? Please show some restraint. Avra's words were as subservient as he could allow himself to be while still drawing a fierce line. He truly couldn't allow Ophelia to go and do as she pleased, or else the event would truly be worried. Ophelia seemed to look right through Avra's for a moment before she finally met his gaze. Avra's shuddered but still remained as strong as he could. No one dared to talk about the history of Ophelia, but he knew it quite well. This woman really did dare to do anything. The fact she was looking at him like this right now likely meant that she would back down, but that didn't mean that she would forget. Lovira's two companions rushed forward to pick her up, Lionel's glance making them shudder. Truthfully, he had only waited so that he could kill all three of them at once. Clearly, they believed that such an attack could only be launched by him once, or at least with poor frequency. But they were very much wrong. However, before Lionel could command his draconic construct to attack again, Aina grabbed his arm. It's not worth it. Pavilion head Ophelia is too powerful, I can't see her limits. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Hearing this, he realized that he might have to change his plans. It might be best to never step foot outside of this city at all, but would that be possible? Lionel calculated some things. Truthfully, he really did need 2 more weeks, only with those 2 more weeks would he be able to accomplish what he had previously failed to. Unless it was possible that he might find something to speed the process up in the Fiend class sector. It seemed that everything would come down to this. Alright, let's finish up here quickly. Lionel wrapped an arm around Aina's waist and took a strong step. A small tornado of wind was left in his wake as he leapt to the top of the horned dragon formed of stone in a single bound. In one moment, he was on the ground, and in the next, he towered over even some of the sky rises. Lionel sent a glance toward TYBTH and the others of the Star Force Pavilion, but they seemed to have begun to show quite a bit of restraint now. The head of the horned dragon swiveled just a small measure, but the three immediately explosively retreated, their gazes narrowed. That attack just now was way too powerful, so much so that it bordered on the explosive power of a 7th-dimensional fire force. They had no idea how Lionel had done it, but what they were certain of was that they wanted no part of it. Without the help of 7th-dimensional materials and maybe even years of rest, there was no way Lovira would be able to display her usual strength. Lionel took control of the horned dragon, urging it forward toward the emerging line of human-class demons. They truly lived up to their name, all of them walking on 2 legs and being humanoid in form. But, however, this was where their similarities ended. It was rare for any of them to have normal flesh-colored skin. Many were covered in scales, some had skin ranging from green to violet, some had bones that grew right out of their skin, and some others seemed to have fused their bodies with armors. No matter which it was, though, all of them exuded towering auras, just the strength of their normal steps causing the ground to whine and crack. However, Lionel simply stood tall, looking down upon them with the same unmoved expression. If he had to face them with his bow and spear, it would indeed be a tall task. However, he suddenly felt very confident that he could wipe them all out with minimal effort on his part. Who asked this city to be so rich in 7th-dimensional materials? They were practically begging him to make it his playground. The horned dragon opened its mouth, a large accumulation of fire force quickly formed. It released a mighty roar just as the expressions of the demons changed. But it was already too late. After all this preparation, they had charged forward with the confidence to wipe out these human youths who treated them like hunting targets. They were completely enveloped by the flames, cries of terror and pain rang out, sounds that one would have never thought a demon could possibly make. Lionel, though, made them seem like nothing more than sheep to the slaughter. Chapter 1562. Published at 27th of January 2023 12:32 and 53 seconds p.m. Chapter 1562. Mantra: if audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Aina watched with raised brows. Even she hadn't expected something like this. It had been a very long time since Lionel crafted anything. Usually for most, their skills would be dull. But it was as though the time off had only made Lionel more powerful in this aspect. Truthfully, Lionel had already had an enormous breakthrough that day he forged armor out of cursed beast skins back during the Void Palace True Selection. However, without his quill, and because he lost little Tolly soon after, he had never had the time to consolidate that breakthrough. Someone else might have allowed that feeling to fade, but for Lionel, who had an entire dream world in his mind, he didn't have to physically practice to improve. In fact, the months of pondering and patience actually allowed him to accumulate more experiences and build atop of that breakthrough he had made. This horned dragon, formed of stone, was an accumulation of all of that, coming together to form a power far beyond Lionel's own and superseding the limits of the younger generation's existence in this place. Best, the form of the dragon came from the Luxnix family force art, its foundation came from the dwarven race's protective force art formation, its ability to accumulate and expel powerful flames came from dimensional cleanse, and very specific runes of his Scarlet Star Force stars, and finally, the force art that catalyzed its change in form from a building into a creature was that Morales family's force art. Lionel's accumulation of knowledge came together and his use of force arts evolved from strict and stringent copying, to something that contained its own life and vitality. He no longer felt restrained by singular force art languages and could seamlessly switch between them all, even fusing them into one to form a new language that even the likes of Avarice wasn't able to recognize. When he was drawing this force art, it felt to him as though his quill had come to life. It became less unruly and it almost fused into his arm as though it couldn't get close enough to him. Lionel could even faintly feel it trying to break free of its gold-grade shackles to truly become a life-grade treasure. It could never have expected that the puny sixth-dimensional existence that had claimed it could possibly give it such a surprise. It's still copying, though. Lionel thought to himself lightly. Without the foundation of the dwarven race's protective formation, Lionel knew that he wouldn't have been able to succeed. While it all sounded impressive, the truth was that Lionel's actual input was minimal. All he really did was give the formation a new form. It was almost like he had stitched together pieces and limbs from different corpses and called it life. One only need to look at the materials to understand. He had used so many seventh-dimensional materials, an entire building's worth, and yet the strength output was still sixth-dimensional. Of course, a part of the problem was the fact that these seventh-dimensional materials weren't perfectly curated toward this sort of result. After all, they were just designed for use as the parts of a building. However, Lionel still wasn't satisfied even as his points jumped up by millions with every attack. His head suddenly turned in a certain direction and the paw of the horned dragon rose up, slapping the javelin out of the air. Bang! A huge shock wave wiped out another troop of demons. Kill, Lionel said lightly. The horned dragon pursed its lip and spit outward. A bullet of fire squeezed into a thin line rocketed through the air, collapsing the sound barrier and superheating the air. It tore through the core of a building without a single sound, leaving a hole so small it was almost impossible to see. But then... boom! The beam collided with the ground, a dome of fire imploding and rising into the air. The horned dragon raised its head, ignoring all the attack that collided with its neck, the ringing sound of metal rebounding off of metal dancing through the air. The dragon sunk down into the ground as the fireball above it suddenly doubled in size. And then it sunk down once again as the fireball doubled in size once more. The mass of the fireball grew so large and so dense that it seemed to have formed a warped gravitational pull of its own, complex runes beginning to form at the mouth of the horned dragon. The human-class demons no longer hesitated, turning tail to run. They seemed to realize at that moment that the worst thing they could have done was gather up in such a large group. It was as though they had all prepared themselves on a platter for Lionel, begging him to kill them. Unfortunately, it was too late. The city stood razed to the ground. Or maybe it was more accurate to say that it was flattened. It seemed as though only one building had survived at all and Lionel's points stood out at over 300 billion. Such an exaggerated total was one the other youths of the human class sector could only look at in silence. How had they been this unlucky? What they didn't know was that they weren't the only ones to suffer. In fact, they probably wouldn't be the last either. Lionel had already gone through the middle class, the high class, and now the human class. There was still one more waiting for him. But first he wanted to see if he could find what he was looking for. Originally, he had ignored all the technique shops because he knew they wouldn't have what he needed. Now that he had so many points, though, it would be a shame if he didn't at least check. There was no telling what kind of variables might be waiting in the fiend class sector. Very soon, Lionel was happy he did. It really is here. He flipped the book in his hands. Dream Force Mantra. Chapter 1563. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:32 and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 1563. 3 hours. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel knew what he was missing, and that was dream runes. The reason he had been able to make the horned dragon so powerful was precisely because he had so many formed runes for his Scarlet Star Force stars. Lionel knew that if he wanted the strength and stamina necessary to succeed in his plan, he would need more dream force than he currently had, and much more powerful dream force at that. Under normal circumstances there was nothing that he could do about this. After all, though his mind was technically in the 7th dimension thanks to his starry-tailed fox lineage factor, it was shackled by his mind to too great of an extent. If he wanted to mitigate this weakness, he could rely on his body. It was too weak of a vessel. The first possibility was to bring his metal body to the 6th dimension as well. That would likely help strengthen his mind once more. But Lionel knew that this increase wouldn't be as exaggerated as his initial breakthrough. Whether it was body or mind, neither was as important as a fundamental change to your nodes. Now, however, there was another path for him to take, and that was to comprehend dream runes. Lionel felt that his dream affinity was so high that so long as he meditated in silence for 2 weeks, he would be able to reach his goals, but he simply didn't have that kind of time left. Aina's words had been a great warning to him. If any other 6th-dimensional existence said they couldn't sense the limits of an old monster like Ophelia, it only made sense. But when someone with such high life force affinity said it, it was a different matter entirely. There likely weren't any tricks Lionel could pull off to deal with Ophelia. That meant that the only option to not step foot out of this city at all. But in order to do that, he needed a shortcut to comprehend his dream runes, and he had just found it. Under the astonished gazes of those watching, right in the middle of the shop, Lionel sat cross-legged. Aina didn't say a word and simply watched over him as the book began to rise and flip before him. Lionel sunk into a state of meditation almost instantly. Right then, 3 silvery stars projected out from his body, growing so large and all-encompassing that the building began to sway. Avraz, who was still whispering calming words to Ophelia in hopes that she would remain calm, almost shot out of his seat again. When he saw the Dream Force stars, he almost choked on air. From the beginning until now, Lionel had never manifested even a single one of his stars, but suddenly seeing it before them all now, Avraz felt like he couldn't breathe properly. And right then, for the very first time, Ophelia's expression also changed, her eyes widening and her heart skipping a beat. Lionel had no idea the kind of commotion he had just caused, but he was already in a state of incomparable focus. He muttered the mantra of the booklet, his comprehension of dimensional cleanse, making it far easier for him to grasp. The book used a concept that he was already familiar with, auspicious air. This auspicious air, in particular, seemed capable of calling forth an especially focused mind toward dream force in particular. It made the vague outline of runes you could sense when you absorbed force feel all the more real and tangible. In just a few seconds, all 3 of Lionel's stars had formed their base star runes. And, as though a snowball gathering momentum down a hill, they began to accumulate faster and faster. With every stroke, Lionel's mind became clearer, his mind faster, and his thoughts sharper. His consciousness became stronger and the vague awakening of his soul that he had experienced so long ago now only became more prominent. Lionel quickly formed 9 base runes and they fused into one. Without even a breath to pause, another set of 9 formed, creating 2 great runes, then 3, then 4. When 9 were formed, the great runes fused once again. The sharper Lionel's mind became, the quicker his lips moved and the faster the great runes accumulated. Aina's expression flickered. Although she couldn't quite understand what was happening, her heart raced completely out of control. There was a feeling weighing down on her, a feeling of such overwhelming familiarity that her eyes began to water beside themselves. She couldn't seem to control it at all, and the tears only came faster. However, she also didn't want to blink, as though if she did, she would suddenly miss everything. And it was exactly then that it happened once more. Snap! The sound echoed throughout the world, even more forceful than the last. Many felt their eardrums pop, their ears beginning to leak blood and, in the worst cases, flesh. Avra's and Ophelia's expression changed once again, but this time it had very little to do with Lionel, or so they thought. Their heads snapped in a certain direction and without hesitation, they both shot forward, Ophelia's speed so fast that she left a blazing trail to her back, leaving Avra's in her dust. However, despite this, Avra's didn't even have the time to smile bitterly, he could only urge himself forward even faster. Not long after the two vanished, the pavilion head of the Star Force Pavilion and others in the know also shot out, leaving streaking meteors in the skies. It was as though what was happening in the city no longer mattered at all. Lionel's brows remained relaxed, one rune after another forming in quick succession. He didn't feel a bottleneck come any time. Over 1,000 runes had already formed and the number only kept growing, shooting over the 6,000 rune mark and surpassing his Scarlet Star Force and becoming the first to form 9 grand runes. However, even then, it didn't slow. In fact, it didn't slow until Lionel had formed 59,049 runes, fusing them into 9 exalted runes. Only then did he finally run into a bottleneck he couldn't push past. But those who understood runes and how they function understood just what this meant. 9 exalted runes. This was the pinnacle of the 7th dimension. Lionel's eyes opened and he snatched the booklet out of the air. How long has it been? Lionel asked, feeling that his sense of time had distorted. 3 hours, Aina replied. All right, let's go claim the top prize and go to the Fiend class sector. Then we can get out of here. Chapter 1564. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:32 and 50 seconds p.m. Chapter 1564. Missing? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What do you see? Lionel looked over toward Aina, a bit curious. She had already received a gold tablet, so Lionel wanted to know what else this system would deem appropriate for her. I see another gold tablet, but I don't think I really need this one. Lionel blinked. Are you just saying that? Or do you really not need it? Lionel looked at her skeptically. Just from the small bit he understood about these word tablets, they were all incredibly valuable in one way or another. He felt that she was just saying so to make sure that he didn't sacrifice another opportunity to her. No, really, Aina laughed. It's about force pill crafting and methods on how to do so, but I don't really need those kinds of constraints. I trained under a master in Valiant Heart Mountain, but I didn't like the experience very much. In fact, I felt it restricted what I could do the moment I got bogged down by convention and rules. I feel freer to do as I please when I don't have to worry about restraints like that at all. Lionel nodded, believing what Aina was saying. She had, indeed, not tried to find another master since leaving Valiant Heart Mountain. In fact, if not for his plans to deal with the Green Thread faction, she wouldn't have even bothered to go and register with their Force Pill faction. Aina's ability index had always been enigmatic to Lionel. It didn't appear in any of the records of the dimensional verse, so he assumed it had to be a unique ability index that hadn't appeared before. What was truly odd about it was that it was hard to tell where her ability index ended and where her blood sovereign abilities began, or if they were one and the same or separate. It also made it especially difficult because her Brazinger family lineage factor also seemed to fuse so well with it as well. Lionel had realized long ago that this was actually why Aina was so powerful. Not only were her individual abilities powerful on their own, but their synergy was on a completely different level. Unlike Lionel, who had many powerful abilities that weren't very related to one another at all, even if you told Lionel that Aina actually had just a single ability that manifested in different ways, he just might believe it. The way Lionel saw it, Aina's ability index was her subconscious understanding of her body that could translate to a conscious control of it. This allowed her to understand exactly how to train, and it was also rooted in a sensitivity to life force. Her blood sovereignty gave her control over blood force, which was the perfect conduit for life force, which was often inaccessible to most. In addition, it multiplied life force affinity in addition to allowing the sensitive control she had over her own life force to extend to her mind and its coercive effects at the same time. Best the cherry on top was her Brazinger family lineage factor, Berserk God, which was once again rooted in an instinctual control of the body. This came with great bodily strength, battle sense, rebirth, and an innate affinity for all weapons. When these things came together, it was easy to mistake the effect of one for the other. But it was also precisely because of this that their combined effects were so great. Lionel also had the feeling that Aina had just scratched the surface of her potential. Her most powerful ability was probably her blood sovereignty, just judging by how much people seemed to want to get at her for it. But it was also the ability she avoided using the most, likely because of those very same reasons. Now, however, she had all the reason in the world to dive headfirst into this new world. And she had even less to worry about with Lionel by her side. Really, go ahead. Aina pushed Lionel forward. Okay. I believe you. Lionel laughed and snatched the silver tablet that was ahead, claiming the top prize for himself. He felt an exceptionally strong urge overwhelm him the moment he touched it. It was even stronger than when he picked up the bronze tablet. His starry-tailed fox lineage factor seemed to want to evolve. However, Lionel was very reluctant. The starry spirit domain was far too useful to him, and the next lineage factor was the twinkling light bear, which was a lot like the white stone elephant in that it focused greatly on strength rather than the mind and speed. Of course, it had a wisdom branch as well, but unless Lionel took time to meditate on the tablet, he couldn't guarantee what the effects of this new lineage factor would be. Although an 8th-dimensional lineage factor sounded far better than a 7th-dimensional one, if it didn't fit well with his battle style, it could instead be a detriment. The starry-tailed fox could have actually been a regression for him since he didn't have the matching techniques. But, because it synergized so well with his ability index, the benefits had far outweighed the drawbacks. However, there was no telling if the twinkling light bear would give him the same benefits. Lionel carefully put the silver tablet away. As far as he saw it, if he was going to take the chance to take on a new lineage factor, he would choose the dark attributes first. At least they shouldn't interfere with his current abilities. At the same time, though, something was nagging at the back of Lionel's mind. All of these tablets carried techniques and were a lot like his Luxnix family's bronze tablet. But, why was it that they didn't even seem to be in the same realm as the silver tablet he received from the Valiant Heart Zone? The gap felt impossibly large. One could break through bottlenecks, break the fundamental laws of physics that governed the world, and even resurrect the dead, and the others seemed capable of passing down techniques. Even if the techniques and lineage factors were powerful, it felt far too lacking in comparison. What was he missing here? Chapter 1565. Published at 27th of January 2023, 12:32 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1565. Toppled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel shook his head. The real reason he asked Aina what she saw was to see if there would be anything like that silver tablet of his, but it seemed that the answer was no. Because Aina's father's bronze tablet seemed to share similar abilities, he had been tricked into thinking that they were far more common than he originally assumed. But what if that wasn't the case? What if it was just a coincidence that he just so happened to run into another such tablet? Regardless, there was no point in dwelling on it any longer. He would only have one more opportunity to check the top prizes, and he didn't even have any intention of fighting for it. The fiend class was simply beyond him right now. Not only was the talent far greater, their realms and tiers were too far beyond him. As powerful as Lionel's dream force had become, his ability index still didn't allow it to project outside of his body. So, he was unable to use it to affect others. Even if they entered the range of his starry spirit domain, at most he'd just be able to show them what was in his dream world. These were the restraints of his ability index, and he would simply need to learn to accept them. Best, however, that wasn't to say that the results were lackluster. In fact, Lionel's Tier 4 control ability index had become so powerful now that he could hardly believe it. He even had a certain hypothesis, which, if found to be correct, could change everything for him. But for now, there were other things to deal with first. Okay, let's go. One more stop. Aina accepted Lionel's hand and nodded as well. Before the pair left, Lionel made sure to trade for a vital star force mantra. His weakest affinity was in it, so without such a mantra, he didn't know how long it would take him to truly master vital star force. As for a scarlet star force mantra, he didn't need one. Why would he? He already had the complete rune in his right kidney. Compared to a mantra, this was even more valuable. With the current strength of his mind, it was only a matter of time before he also brought his scarlet star force to the pinnacle of the 7th dimension as well. Of course, there was another problem. And that was that this place didn't even have a scarlet star force mantra even if he did want to trade for it. What was truly lamentable was that there wasn't a void star force mantra either. It seemed that his hypothesis would have to work out if he wanted anything more than the bare-boned ability of those 2 stars currently in his ethereal glabella. The good news was that Lionel was able to trade for a blood force and life force mantra for Aina. Each cost billions, but it was a worthwhile investment. He would definitely have Aina start mastering dimensional cleanse as quickly as possible, so she would soon need them. This did make Lionel wonder, though. Dream Force and Life Force were at least as valuable as Void Star Force and Scarlet Star Force, so why were the former 2 present, but the latter 2 weren't? There was probably something else about this that Lionel didn't quite understand. But he hoped that there would be a Void Star Force to trade for in the coming sector. Lionel and Aina entered the Fiend class sector not long afterward, but they were surprised to find that there wasn't a city here at all where they thought they would find one. Instead, it was like they were transported right into the demon world. Lionel's brows furrowed. Shit, it wasn't like they were transported, they really had been. It seemed that the battlefield for the Fiend class sector was the real demon world. But that was a huge problem. What's wrong? Aina asked, worried. If we're here, it makes my plan more difficult. The spatial barriers around here would make the calculations much more difficult to pin down, and it makes it worse that there's this evolved anarchic force in the air. The materials I've already gathered only have a 20% chance of working in this place. We would need to return to the human world to give ourselves the best chance. Hearing this, Aina's brows also furrowed. There were too many enemies outside. Even setting aside Ophelia and whatever organizations that might be pissed by their monopolization of 3 different top prizes, Lionel still hadn't forgotten about the oligarch family. His original plan for revenge was to just let them deal with the fallout of this matter. But now, it seemed that he would have to face them head-on. It was already too late to adjust his original plan. To make matters worse, because they were currently in this place, there was no huge amount of high-dimensional materials for Lionel to use to form another construct. Lionel had already abandoned the previous one because he knew it wasn't powerful enough to move the needle in the Fiend class sector, it would just drag them down and make them a huge target. But now, he almost regretted that decision. Some protection would be better than none. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, his heartbeat slowing to a crawl and his mind cooling down. The issue with thinking so fast was that you also thought of all of the potential problems all at once as well. It was helpful sometimes, but it was often easy to overanalyze as well. Were they in danger of death? Yes. Was it likely, though? Not with him here. Lionel's expression went cold. All at once, both he and Aina manifested their weapons, turning in the same direction at once. The ground rumbled and the trees toppled over, a lumbering 4-meter-tall figure walking forward slowly. Everything in its path was flattened, crushed like weeds. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.